Kate McCann stated in her book that she washed Madeleine's pyjamas on the Thursday morning, the 3rd of May 2007, the day she says Madeleine was abducted. She said it was to wash away a tea stain. After Madeleine was reported missing, the McCanns gave the police a description of the pyjamas in which Madeleine was said to have been stolen from her bed. This photograph appeared in several British newspapers 6 days after Madeleine's reported disappearance. And because the image had been supplied to the press by the Portuguese police, people assumed it was a police photograph taken by the Portuguese police. The image is not, in fact, an official police photograph. It was supplied to the police by the McCanns or somebody associated with the McCanns. In the released Portuguese police files is a note by Detective Constable Markley of Leicestershire Police, written on or after the 8th of May, exhibiting a black and white copy of this photograph, among others, and headed "Information from the Family." About a month after the image was featured in the media, on the 5th of June on Crime Watch, and again 2 days later at a press conference in Amsterdam, Gerry McCann held up the very same pair of pyjamas. We know they are the same because they share identical imperfections due to having been worn. At this press conference, the McCanns claimed that these pyjamas belonged to Madeleine's then 2-year-old sister and that they were producing them because they were similar to those Madeleine was wearing when abducted. These pyjamas were most likely from the 2006 range of Marks & Spencer's Eeyore pyjamas, when Madeleine's sister was little more than 1 year old. It is plain that they are far too large to have been bought for someone so young. Even Madeleine's sister herself confirmed they were not hers. Gerry's brother, John McCann, speaking to the media days after Madeleine was reported missing, said that Kate was dressing her in a pair of her sister's pyjamas, and she exclaimed, "Maddie's jammies! Where is Maddie?" So there are several lines of evidence that the pyjamas Gerry is holding up, which are the same pyjamas in this image, in fact belonged to Madeleine and not to her younger sister. These are the very same pyjamas that Kate McCann said she washed on the morning they said Madeleine was taken. So if Madeleine's pyjamas were not abducted, neither was Madeleine. The reasons why we now know these pyjamas belonged to Madeleine are explained in more detail in these two articles, an article by Madeleine McCann researcher Dr. Martin Roberts and one by Nigel Moore, and I'd like to thank them for their detailed research. Kate said she washed Madeleine's pyjamas on the morning of the day they reported her missing. The pyjamas in this photograph show signs that they are still damp. The blue background cloth in the image is identical to the furniture in the McCann's apartment. If it is true that Kate washed Madeleine's pyjamas on the morning of the 3rd of May 2007, then the McCanns themselves may have taken this photograph on the morning of the day they said she was abducted, ready to hand it to the Portuguese police after the planned abduction hoax which was to follow.
I'm looking for younger sisters that are a little bit smaller than Madeleine's. As you can see, it's a cute top with an actor viola and short sleeves. White pyjamas bottoms and a floral print on, and a picture of you on the right leg, lower right leg. So as I say, these are virtually identical to what Madeleine's wearing, only they're a little bit smaller.
This is my fourth release of films exploring the mystery of the alleged disappearance of Madeleine McCann and how Britain's mainstream media have for 10 years withheld from the public many key facts surrounding what happened. In my first set of films, I set out hundreds of facts which to me suggest Madeleine died in her parents' holiday apartment in Praia de Luz and that they, perhaps helped by others for whatever reason, covered up her death. I examined the findings of one of the world's top dog handlers, Martin Grime. His cadaver and blood dogs between them made 17 alerts to the past presence of a corpse and blood. I discussed the McCann's reactions to these dramatic findings.
This is the first time that you give us a big interview, not being Arguidos since then. So now I feel free to ask you this directly. How can you explain the coincidence of the scent of the cadaver felt by British and not Portuguese dogs?
Sandra, maybe you should be asking the judiciary because they've examined all this.
But don't you have an explanation
we're
for
obviously
that?
Madeleine's mum and dad, and we're desperate for people to help us find Madeleine, which is why we're here today. The majority of people are inherently good, and I believe the majority of people in Portugal are inherently good people, and we're asking them if they'll help us spread this message to that person or people.
So you don't have any explanation for that?
Ask the dogs, Sandra.
Ask the dogs, no, Jerry. Now I think that I feel free to ask you.
They also claimed the dogs had only alerted to dirty nappies or rotting meat. I dealt with mountains of circumstantial evidence which in my opinion implicate the McCanns and some of their friends in the cover-up of Madeleine's death. There were irreconcilable contradictions between witness statements. In one case, with the alleged visit of the McCann's friend David Payne to the McCann's apartment at 6:30 p.m, the night Madeleine was reported missing, I identified no fewer than 20 contradictions. I noted several changes of story about the events of the 3rd of May. Whether the apartment was broken into or not, whether the patio door was left unlocked or not, whether the McCanns entered by the front door or not. I looked at changes of story about how the wind was supposed to have blown the curtains open and closed the door shut when Kate McCann supposedly did her 10 p.m. check. I also delved into the extraordinary range of individuals and agencies used by the McCann team for their private investigation. Most of them were thoroughly disreputable and some turned out to be crooks. Two of them, Antonio Gimenez Raso and Kevin Halligan, each spent 4 years in jail on charges respectively of corruption in public office and a $1.5 million fraud. Another, Gary Hagland, was an expert in advising companies on avoiding being accused of money laundering. Others had connections with MI5 and the British security services. I then went on to examine the huge involvement of the British establishment in the case from day one. Tony Blair's chief media advisor, Clarence Mitchell, was on the case from the early days. He once boasted that his job was to control what comes out in the media. An assortment of PR men, lawyers, British police and security services, criminal profilers from MI5 and others also descended on Praia de Luz in the first few days. The Metropolitan Police Force's supposed 6-year-long investigation, Operation Grange, which began in 2011, was set up after Rebecca Brooks, then the CEO of Rupert Murdoch's News International empire, manipulated David Cameron into action after reportedly threatening him with a week of bad headlines about Theresa May. And it seems now that Operation Grange was never intended to be a real investigation. It was another intelligence tool with which to mislead the public into accepting a bogus abduction claim. Grange was a psychological operation, a psyop. In fact, the whole case has been a 10-year-long psyop. In my second release, I highlighted what I called 4 phantom abductors. I exposed the claim by Nuno Lourenco that a Polish holidaymaker, Wojciech Krakowski, had tried to kidnap Lourenco's young daughter as an obvious fabrication. I showed how his false claim derailed the Portuguese police investigation in its early stages. I then presented evidence that the McCann's friend, Jane Tanner, had fabricated her claim of seeing a man carrying a child near the McCann's apartment at 9:15 p.m. the night Madeleine was reported missing. After that, I showed that Martin Smith and family from Ireland, who claimed to have seen a man carrying a child at 10 p.m. that night, contacted me to distance himself from Robert Murat, but then failed to reply to my follow-up questions about their alleged sighting. As far as I'm aware, the Smiths have never gone on camera with their account. If they wanted to clear things up about whether they knew Robert Murat, why couldn't they clear up some very basic unanswered questions about what they said they saw? For these reasons, in my opinion, their account remains another possible fabrication. Finally, I examined the claim by DCI Redwood from the Met's Operation Grange to have found the person that Jane Tanner claimed she saw. He claimed that 6 years after the event, this man had come forward to say that he had been carrying a child home from the night creche that night. Was this man living without a television in a hole in the ground for the previous 6 years? He has never been named, and I believe DCI Redwood should be arrested and charged with perverting the course of justice, as I am fully convinced this was yet another piece of fabricated evidence. In my third release, titled When Madeleine Died, I examined every claimed sighting of Madeleine working backwards from 10 p.m. on the Thursday the 3rd of May. None of the sightings could be verified until I reached a detailed sighting by a cleaner who had clearly observed the entire McCann family, including Madeleine, at lunchtime on Sunday the 29th of April. With the help of a retired police superintendent who has studied the Madeleine McCann case for the past 10 years, I was able to present convincing evidence that the so-called last photo of Madeleine, which the McCanns said was taken at 2:29 p.m. on the Thursday the 3rd of May, was probably taken at lunchtime 4 days earlier on Sunday the 29th of April. I have concluded there is no credible evidence from other witnesses independent of the McCanns and their friends that Madeleine was seen alive after Sunday. In November 2016, I travelled to the United States to get the opinion of highly respected statement analyst Peter Hyatt, who is an expert in analysing witness statements for possible deception. I recorded a 2-hour-long interview in which Peter Hyatt analysed an interview the McCanns gave for Australian television in 2011. Although Peter Hyatt had not watched any of my films, he came to identical conclusions.
What I concluded from just this interview itself is that Madeleine is dead, the death was not intentional, that they have disposed of her remains in a hidden manner of which they feel confident will not be found. The cause of death was likely not intended and may have included both causing her to be very sleepy and a fall. They have feared being accused, their concerns about themselves, and that the time frame that they've given must be questioned. Those are things that I conclude strongly. Now, underneath that is the possibility of sexual abuse being part of this equation is strong.
In this release, my fourth set of films, I will deal with two issues I promised earlier to look at. One is the role of the initial chief suspect in this case, Robert Murat. The other is the issue of how Madeleine died and why it was covered up. I believe I have demonstrated in previous films that Madeleine died earlier in the week, and I believe that the McCanns, with the help from many powerful people and millions of pounds donated by the British public, have covered up her tragic fate. From now on in the film, I am assuming Madeleine died during the 2007 holiday and was not abducted. I will not specifically say each time alleged death or allegedly died. I will speak as though this is true, so that the narrative flows better. But I state now that the death is based on my own belief, which is based on the evidence I have revealed. It is not a statement of legal fact. There is no suggestion at all, by the way, that Robert Murat was involved in Madeleine's death. It is the extraordinary things that happened after her death that I shall be examining in relation to Robert Murat. Murat flew out to Portugal from the UK at 7 a.m. on Tuesday the 1st of May 2007. This is about a day and a half after the time when I believe Madeleine died, and 2.5 days before the McCanns reported Madeleine missing. Murat was born in London in 1973. At the time of Madeleine's reported disappearance, he was just 33 years old. His father, John Murat, was born in Portugal, but he was sent to England to be tutored at the Hillbrow School, an exclusive boarding school in Eastbourne. Later he went to Bradfield College, where he was a contemporary of comedian Tony Hancock. When Murat was less than 1 month old, his parents moved from England to Portugal, initially living near Lagos, where Mr. Murat Sr. pursued property interests. He died when Murat was 12. Murat's aunt and uncle, Sally and Ralph Everleigh, also live close by in Burgau. In my first Madeleine film, I filmed at their property, Salsalitas, which was subject to a long search by the Portuguese police following Madeleine's disappearance. Like his parents, Murat's early life was split between Portugal and England. During this time he became bilingual in Portuguese and English. His early education was at the English language Barlavento School and the International School on the Algarve coast. He was then sent to England to study, finally returning to a secondary school in Lagos until he was 16. Then he went back to England and lived with his maternal grandmother in Sidmouth, Devon for a spell. This unsettled to and fro way of life in England one moment and in Portugal the next may explain the very disturbing statement I am now about to read from. It was a witness statement taken by the Portuguese police from a family friend of the Murats, a Mr. Carlos Costa. I can't guarantee its accuracy, as his evidence hasn't been tested in court, but I believe we should take it into account in order to shed possible light on Murat's psychology before we look at his involvement. He has known Robert Murat for about 25 years. He got to know him while working at Jacinto and Murat from 1982 to 84. At this time, Robert was 8 years old. Immediately one noticed that Robert had a strange personality, staying away from people and not wanting to engage. He had somewhat of a violent attitude. He remembers an episode where Robert, on the veranda on the first floor of the firm, threw vases from that exterior without checking to see if anyone was underneath him. A neighbour told him that Robert had tried to have sexual relations with her mother's cat. The animal responded by scratching him on various parts of his body. These injuries were seen by the deponent, given that he, Robert, had visited the Castillejo beach in Villa de Bispo on various occasions. On one of these occasions, he saw Robert scratching at excoriations. He was told by L that Robert had killed the cat out of spite. He also states that he witnessed a macabre episode perpetrated by Robert. He saw him once again trying to have relations, this time with the family dog, who ended up being forced into the house, situated in Almedina y Las Velas. He states that when he went to the beach with Robert, he, Robert, would stay away from the rest of the group, about 15 to 20 metres, and not say a word to anyone the whole day. He also adds that a cousin of Robert, of British nationality, whose name he does not know, and who lives in his house, has suffered an assault by Robert. For this reason she left the home. These acts were hidden by Robert's mother, who protected him and who never punished him. At this point, Robert was 16 years old. He would like to add that according to what he knows about Robert, he was not surprised that he was described as a disturbed person and could very easily turn violent. He is also someone with a sadistic and deviant sexual personality, and who is also misanthropic. This is based on contact with him for 15 years. If he did abduct this child, then the witness believes she may be dead. He concludes this from Robert's violent and deviant personality. He adds still that he also was violent with his mother when he was reprimanded and would react by kicking her. He asserts that Robert did receive psychiatric treatment whilst in the UK. So, Mr. Costa describes here a person who was prone to sexual deviance, violence and sadism, and has given specific examples. After Murat left school, he began selling double glazing and then later became a car salesman. He moved to Norfolk, where he again worked for a car sales firm called Inchcape, and then for turkey farmer Bernard Matthews. It appears he also worked occasionally as a Portuguese-English interpreter for the police. This experience was to become very relevant in the events following Madeleine's alleged disappearance, as we shall see. At the age of 28, Murat married Dawn, a woman several years older than himself, who already had one child. Murat and Dawn had a child, Sophia, the following year, who was nearly 5 at the time Madeleine was reported missing. Murat persuaded Dawn to move to Portugal, but a few months later they agreed to live separately, Dawn moving back to Norfolk and Murat staying in Portugal with his mother in her home, the Casa Liliana. Murat would visit his daughter from time to time in England. They then agreed to get divorced. The week that the McCanns went on their ill-fated holiday to Portugal, Murat says he was staying with his sister in Sidmouth. He had another sister in nearby Exeter. His grandmother had died, and Murat said he was engaged in renovating her home in Sidmouth. The events begin on Monday the 30th of April. That was the third day of the McCanns' holiday. It is also the very next day after what I said in my last film was the last credible sighting of Madeleine at lunchtime on Sunday the 29th of April. As my previous film showed, it is probable that Madeleine was already dead by the 30th of April. On that Monday, it is likely that someone spoke by phone to Murat from Portugal on the 30th, which prompted him to come over to Praia da Luz as soon as possible. It has never been clear who made such an all-important call to him. He booked a flight late on the night of the 30th to leave Exeter Airport, just hours before the flight took off at 7 a.m. on Tuesday the 1st of May. Looking at the history of Murat's travel to and from Portugal before May 2007, he says he made trips back to England to see his wife and daughter in these months. So if we look at the records obtained by the Portuguese police, we find him taking a trip back to Portugal on the 2nd of January 2007. He stays there for nearly 3 months and then flies back to England on the 20th of March 2007, ostensibly to refurbish his grandmother's home, or visit his ex-wife and daughter, or maybe both. So he had been back in England for about 6 weeks before someone, we are not sure who, required his urgent presence back in Portugal. The reason it seems sudden or urgent is because there is such little time between him buying the ticket and flying out. If we examine the telephone records from the landline of Robert Murat's mother, Jennifer Murat, these reveal quite intense telephone activity on Monday the 30th of April between her phone and 2 Exeter telephone numbers, one of them being Murat's sister's phone, where Murat appeared to have been staying at the time. One of these phone calls to a UK landline just after 9 a.m. lasted over an hour. Some of these calls were to a UK mobile phone number. Why was Murat's mother speaking to him that day? Or could someone else have made the call? Michaela Walchuk, his fiancée perhaps? Michaela Walchuk's mobile phone records on that Monday morning show that she made several long phone calls instead of her usual short ones. But whatever calls Murat did receive that may have prompted his early morning flight to Portugal, he boarded the 7 a.m. flight to Faro and was there by 9 a.m. And there to meet him was his mother. Murat was first pulled in by the police for questioning on the 14th of May. They questioned him about his movements from arrival at Faro on the 1st of May up to the morning of the 4th of May after Madeleine was reported missing. Remember, it is assumed Madeleine is already dead before he arrives in Portugal. Here is the record from his first interview. I will give a summary of his movements based on his statement. Tuesday the 1st of May. Arrived at 9:30 at the airport in Faro, where he was met by his mother. stopped at a petrol station at the airport exit that had closed toilets. He didn't eat anything or fill up the car. He then drove to the A22, where he stopped at the first service station on the way. He drank a latte coffee, as did his mother. He ate a meat pie, and his mother had a cheese and ham croissant. Soon after that, they went directly to Casa Liliana in Praia de Luz, where he arrived between 11:30 and noon. Without unpacking his suitcase or entering his home, he went in the VW to see Michaela, his fiancée, at the house in Lagos where she lived with her husband, Luis Antonio, arriving between 12 and 12:30, where he took some gifts for both her and her daughter. Michaela and Luis Antonio were in the process of divorcing. He remained in her house, he thinks, until between 3 and 3:30 p.m, talking with the entire family, including the child's father, Luis Antonio. He then drove himself home, where he arrived at 4 p.m. He does not remember having gone to another place before arriving at his mother's house. Once at home, he does not know if he went out again that day. Wednesday the 2nd of May. He got up at around 9 a.m. and left home between 10 and 10:30 a.m. He went to Lagos in the VW to Michaela's, where he arrived at 10:40. He entered her house and she was alone. He remained there for a short time talking. They left there and went in the VW to the centre of Lagos. He parked in a street and went to the home of Francisco Pagaret, his lawyer, who was not there, but Pagaret's girlfriend was there. Next, he went to meet his future real estate partners in their store called Putos Graudos, located in Lagos, whose current line of business is the sale of clothing, owned by Jorge Silva. After the meeting in the store, he went to a cafe with Michaela, Jorge Silva and Jorge's son Jason. Soon after this, they went to another cafe located in Lagos Marina, which was less noisy, where they talked about business. He had a latte to drink, but does not know if the others did. The bill was paid by Michaela in the first cafe, and he has no idea who paid in the second. They remained in the second cafe until between 10 to 2 and 2 p.m. After the marina, they walked back to the VW, and he then had lunch in the Bembom restaurant in Lagos, this time only with Michaela. They arrived just after 2 o'clock. He ate roast meat, and lunch ended between 3:15 and 3:20. They then went to the school to pick up Michaela's 8-year-old daughter, arriving at around 3:25. They then went back to the home of Pagaret, who this time was present. They spoke with Pagaret about Murat's divorce and about building properties while standing next to the VW. He and Michaela then returned to Michaela's house in Lagos with her daughter. He remained in the apartment with Michaela and her daughter for a long time. Her husband Louis arrived by 9 p.m. or shortly after, when they were having dinner of pork or turkey. He left Michaela's home at between 10:30 and 11 p.m. in the VW and went to his mother's house in Praia de Luz, parked the vehicle in front of the house, spoke with his mother who was awake, played cards on his computer and went to sleep between 1 and 1:30 a.m. He remained at the house until the next morning. Thursday the 3rd of May. He woke up between 8 and 9 a.m, took a bath, dressed, drank some tea, then left the house in the VW at 10. He presumes he went to Lagos to see Michaela. He does not know where he parked the VW. He went up to her apartment, rang the bell, Michaela opened the door. Only Michaela was at home. They talked about the website for their real estate project in the lounge and in the kitchen for quite some time. They left the apartment at around noon in the VW, taking the roads towards Portimao. Before Odeixer, they went round the access roundabout to the A22. 10 to 15 minutes after leaving the apartment, they came to the petrol pumps of the Galp M24 service station on the A22, where they had lunch. They left the service station and returned to the apartment, where they once again spoke about various things. They collected Michaela's daughter from school in the VW at 3:30 p.m, and the three were then met with Jorge Silva and his son. He does not know where, but believes it was at the Lagos Marina. There they went into a cafe whose name he can't recall. It was next to a play area for children where Michaela's daughter played. They spoke about Ramajan, their new business venture, and the meeting finished late, he thinks between 6 and 7. Everybody left together, went to the VW, which was parked in the car park at the rear of the marina. They gave a ride to Jorge Silva and his son, dropping them off at the bus station next to the CTT in the city, arriving between 7:15 and 7:30. He parked the VW in front of the house and does not recall if his mother was at home when he arrived, but he thinks so, because it was late for her to walk the dogs, as she usually leaves at 5 and returns at 7. After entering the house, he may have drunk tea and watched television. He may also have read a newspaper. He talked with his mother about Ramadan, ate a ham and cheese sandwich, sitting in the kitchen with his mother, until between 10 and 11 p.m. Contrary to what he said originally, he was not with Michaela when she went to a Jehovah's Witness meeting between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. This is why he didn't phone her, because she turns her phone off in the meetings. He doesn't know if he called her after 10 p.m, but accepts that is a possibility. He was at home with his mother when at 10:30 p.m. or a little later, he heard the siren of an ambulance or police. He commented on that to his mother. However, he did not leave the house to investigate. He did not leave again until the next morning, having gone to bed around midnight. Friday the 4th of May. Woke at around 9 a.m, took a bath, went to the kitchen where his mother told him that something terrible had happened. A child had disappeared in Praia de Luz, according to Sky News. As soon as he heard this, he and his mother went to look in the garden, which is enclosed with a high wall and fence. They checked to see if the child had managed to enter. They also searched the greenhouse. Then they saw an English passerby. He does not know who the passerby was. The passerby told him that a child had disappeared. Accompanied by that person, he went to the place of the disappearance and was introduced to the parents of Madeleine McCann because he spoke the two languages, Portuguese and English. He started a conversation with the family of the child, offering to help. Together with an officer of the GNR, the local police, and an employee of the resort using several keys, he entered several apartments, opened with the keys supplied by the employees or by the tenants in order to try and locate the child. Some of the apartments were closed and there were no keys for them. These sites were flagged by the GNR man. At this time he met John Hill, the manager of the complex, who supplied them with more keys to the apartments. Now I'm going to come back in a moment to what Murat did after Madeleine was reported missing, but first I need to look at a second series of statements that Murat made to the Portuguese police some 2 months later. He was thoroughly re-questioned on the 10th and 11th of July. By then, the Portuguese police had gathered third-party information about Murat. Notably, they had interrogated his mobile phone records, and they showed that Murat had been lying to them in his initial statements on the 14th of May. Here is his full statement. It is very different from his first one. Altogether, there are around 20 changes of story, some more important than others. Let's just explain some of the more important ones. He failed to mention that on Wednesday the 2nd of May, he met Sergei Malinka at the Batista supermarket near his mother's house at about 10 a.m. That may be significant, as he also failed to remember ringing Sergei Malinka just before midnight on the night Madeleine was reported missing. The evidence is quite clear that Murat and Malinka were long-time associates in some business or other, so it seems odd that Murat would not admit to having had contact with him. Later that morning, he originally said he had not met his lawyer Francisco Pagaret, but in his second statement admitted that he had met him. He says that in the afternoon, on either the 2nd or the 3rd, he visited 2 houses in Lagos with Michaela, each visit lasting about 20 to 30 minutes. Why did he not mention visiting these 2 houses when first interviewed? He does not name the owner, nor does he say why he visited these 2 houses. On the 2nd of May in the evening, he originally said that he and Michaela were at Michaela's home with Michaela's husband Louis, but in his second statement he says her husband wasn't there. On Thursday the 3rd of May, he said he spent the morning after about 10:30 a.m. with Michaela. In his later statement, however, he admitted that he had had a business appointment at a tourist complex called Montinos de Oura in Espiche at 9:30 a.m, where he says he met the father-in-law, a builder, of the lady owner of the complex. This was a major omission. Moreover, Murat doesn't give the lady owner's name, saying he can't remember it. and he again doesn't say what the purpose of this meeting was. On the afternoon that day, Murat originally said he had spent the afternoon with Michaela at her apartment. He now said that he had been with Jorge Silva, his son, and Michaela at the Palmeiras Golf Club. That was another major omission. Why did he not reveal that the first time? And why did they drive several miles from Espiche to the Palmeiras Golf Club on the Thursday afternoon, when they could have carried on talking in the cafe in Lagos or Praia da Luz? Was something very secret being discussed? I visited the golf club in 2014 when I was researching my first Madeleine film. Just pulled up at the Palmeiras Golf Club, which is a few miles east of Lagos, maybe 7 or 8 miles east of Praia da Luz. The movements of Gerry McCann on that Thursday afternoon are shrouded in mystery by a series of inexplicable contradictions. Is it possible that Murat met with him that afternoon at the Palmeiras Golf Club? A place Gerry might well have known, as he had previously been on golfing holidays on the Algarve coast. On that afternoon, in his first statement, Murat said that he and Michaela collected her daughter from school after 3 p.m. and then spent most of the next 4 hours talking to Michaela and her daughter, together with Jorge Silva and his son, up to about 7 p.m. But in his more recent statement, he now says he went straight from school to Michaela's home and did not meet Jorge Silva and his son. Murat's phone records showed that he phoned his friend Sergei Malinka at 11:39 p.m. on the 3rd of May, i.e. the night Madeleine was reported missing. They also showed that he phoned Michaela 1 minute earlier. But he did not mention either of these phone calls in his first statement. The day after, on Friday morning, the 4th of May, he originally claimed to have woken up at about 9 a.m. and then had a bath. But when he was shown that he had made a phone call to Michaela at 8:27 a.m. that morning, he now admitted that he must have phoned her then, though he couldn't remember it, and must have woken up earlier. If we go back to the top of Murat's second statement, we find the excuses he makes for having got so many things wrong. He says he was tired, confused, and even rattled by the police interview. It seems likely to me that he deliberately withheld information, which was only forced out of him because his mobile phone had pinged in a number of places he had not previously mentioned. In his statements, he mentions his proposed estate agency business Romijan and developing a website for it. The RO was for Robert and the MI was for Michaela. As it transpired, no such business was ever established. According to his statements, he spent a lot of time discussing this. Murat would have us believe that he discussed the Romijan business on the Wednesday morning and later that morning and again on Wednesday afternoon. The Thursday afternoon and evening was apparently another long meeting in a cafe where Romijan was discussed, and again with Jorge Silva present, except that when re-questioned, Murat later said that no such meeting took place that day. So did it really take 4 separate meetings in different places to discuss a future business? Or were he and the Silvas discussing other matters? Then there are the unexplained meetings. There were either 1 or 2 meetings with his lawyer Francisco Pagaret, but we are not told what they are about. Caught out by the police, Murat admitted attending a meeting in Espiche on the Thursday morning. He doesn't mention the subject matter of the meeting, nor does he give the name of the lady tourist complex owner or the father-in-law builder. Nothing is checkable. Then, caught out by police a second time, he has to admit that on Thursday afternoon he was at the Palmeiras Golf Club, miles away from Michaela's home in Lagos and from his home in Praia da Luz, something he forgot to mention when first questioned. Why did he go there? Who else was there? Furthermore, it was only during Murat's second interview that he casually mentions visiting 2 houses, either on the Wednesday or Thursday in the company of Michaela and the unnamed house owner. Once again, Murat doesn't tell us what the purpose of those visits were. To sum up then, Murat gave a false account of his movements from the 1st to the 4th of May when first questioned. His second statement is very different. He gives us more detail, but not much. He meets people whose names he doesn't tell us, nor why he met them. If he was evasive or lied the first time police talked to him, could he have done the same in the second interview? On the morning of Friday the 4th of May, Robert Murat became an official interpreter for the Portuguese police. He was bilingual in English and Portuguese. How did he become a key translator? There are two separate versions of how this came about. Version 1 is that an Englishman from Stevenage, Stephen Carpenter, as we saw earlier in Murat's first statement, just happened to be strolling past his mother's villa on the Friday morning following Madeleine being reported missing. Murat and Carpenter agree that this was between 9 and 10 a.m. Now, we just saw that Murat had to change part of that story because his mobile phone records revealed that he had made a phone call to his fiancée Michaela that morning at 8:27 a.m. In his first statement, talking about the night Madeleine was reported missing, it states, 10:30 p.m. or a little later, he heard a siren of an ambulance or police. He commented on that with his mother, however, did not leave the house to investigate. Let us also recall that he forgot when giving his first statement that he had called his friend Sergei Malinka at 11:39 p.m. the night Madeleine was reported missing, and made another call a minute earlier to his fiancée Michaela. If Murat is to be believed, he knew nothing that night about a child being missing, despite having heard ambulance and police sirens. At the time he rang Sergei and Michaela, people were running about the village shouting, "Maddie, Maddie." And let's not forget, his mother's house was just yards from the McCann's apartment. Let's also remind ourselves that Murat was very well known and connected in Praia de Luz. His mother had lived there for decades. The police found dozens of phone numbers on his mobile. Here is a list of them. He was one of the most known local people. His mother was on the local residence committee. He was a local businessman. Murat's claim to have known nothing about Madeleine's disappearance on that night does not seem remotely credible. So was Murat trying to distance himself from having known anything about Madeleine's disappearance until the Friday morning? Murat says that after learning from Carpenter that Madeleine was about the same age as his own daughter, he eagerly volunteered the information that he was bilingual and offered to act as a translator. Pull the other one. So they went up to the Ocean Club where Murat says he was introduced to Jerry and Kate McCann and offered his help as a translator. But is that the real story? To answer this, I'm going to read from an article by a well-briefed independent Portuguese journalist, Paulo Reis. Reis clearly had access to Portuguese police sources who were leaking him information from the Madeleine McCann investigation. In early 2008, he wrote this about Bill Henderson, the British ambassador to Portugal. Staff from Bill Henderson's office suggested the name of Robert Murat as a reliable translator who could be used in the police inquiry in the days following Madeleine McCann's disappearance. Murat was already known among diplomatic staff as he had letters of recommendation from Norfolk Police. He had been working in Norfolk for Bernard Matthews, one of the largest poultry farm companies in the UK, which employs hundreds of Portuguese workers. The fact that Robert Murat has acted before as a translator for Norfolk Police under the recommendation issued by Bill Henderson's office led police to accept the suggestion, according to PJ, Portuguese police sources. After Murat was named a formal suspect, the police went through all translations he had done, checking their accuracy, but no problem was found according to the same sources. Bill Henderson retired from his diplomatic post and went back to the UK in August. Now, bearing in mind the conclusion I made in my last film, that Madeleine may have died as early as Sunday the 29th of April, if that is correct, those who plotted to pass off Madeleine's sudden death as an abduction would have had 4 days to put in hand all the specific plans necessary to make the abduction story as convincing as possible. In order to do that, how convenient would it be to have an insider like Robert Murat in place at just the right time to act as one of the key translators for the police? Was Robert Murat made ready to be in just the right place at the right time to act as a translator when the Portuguese police needed to speak to Jerry and Kate McCann and the rest of their Tapa 7 friends about what had happened to Madeleine? What is very clear from Paulo Reis's report is that the British ambassador and his staff already knew Robert Murat. They had a recommendation apparently from Norfolk Police. That seems curious, as I can find no reference to Robert Murat being an accredited interpreter. Could it be that Robert Murat was a known asset to British intelligence, and his ability to act as an interpreter was one of a number of reasons why someone on Monday the 30th of April may have summoned him to get over to Portugal without delay? If he were to be an interpreter right from the start, he would be in prime position to let key people know what was going on in those all-important first few days of the investigation, sometimes known as the golden period, in which vital clues may be gained or lost. And the Portuguese police records show that Murat was the interpreter for all these English-speaking witnesses. I'm now going to show how Murat strayed well beyond his role as an interpreter by quoting from a report by one of Gonçalo Amaral's key senior staff, Inspector Veranda. He was so concerned about Murat's conduct as an interpreter that on the 11th of May, after Murat had been translating for a week, he filed a complaint about him to Amaral, who was leading the investigation. Veranda made these 8 key accusations against him. He kept on asking insistently about the identity of possible suspects. He kept on asking about the strategy of the investigation. He kept on asking about what work was going on to be done in the coming days. He kept on trying to steal a look at confidential documents. He had detailed knowledge of the Ocean Club garden. He had detailed knowledge of what the McCanns and their friends had been doing that week in Praia de Luz. He actively tried to influence the conduct of the investigation. He persistently suggested that foreigners were responsible for abducting Madeleine. At point 5, Inspector Veranda states that Murat had detailed knowledge of the Ocean Club garden. But as we saw earlier, when Murat gave his first untrue statement to the police, he told the Portuguese police he did not know the interior of the Ocean Club, only entering the resort after the disappearance. I do not believe that Murat had never in his life entered the Ocean Club until after Madeleine had been reported missing. I also want to highlight this part of Murat's first statement. He started a conversation with the family of the child, offering to help. Together with an officer of the GNR and an employee of the resort with several keys, entered several apartments, opened with the keys or by the tenants in order to locate the child. Some of the apartments were closed and there were no keys. These sites were flagged by the GNR man. At that time, he met John Hill, manager of Mark Warner, who supplied them with more keys to the other apartments. So, was Robert Murat already acquainted with the McCanns? I will return to that subject in a moment. We see here that he was able to talk to the McCanns on the morning after Madeleine had been reported missing. But just as interesting is why Murat was invited by Mark Warner top brass and Ocean Club manager John Hill to accompany him and a GNR police officer as he went round the Ocean Club opening up various apartments. And after that, the GNR officer and Murat were given keys to other apartments. I can understand a GNR officer being given keys, but I cannot see any valid reason as to why Murat should accompany him. It looks to me as though Murat was rapidly, on the very first morning following Madeleine's disappearance, being given great privileges, both searching the apartments and being made the chief interpreter. Not surprisingly, after receiving Inspector Veranda's report, Gonçalo Amaral soon removed him from his interpreting duties. But how much valuable information could Murat have passed on to others from the very heart of the investigation? Let me turn now to an astonishing sequence of events which seemed designed to put Robert Murat in the frame as the lead suspect for having allegedly abducted Madeleine McCann. As I have mentioned, due to the evidence in my previous film, I believe Madeleine was already dead before Murat got to Portugal, so I am making no suggestion that Murat was involved in Madeleine's death. The first person I've been able to determine to publicly point the finger at Murat was a young journalist called Laurie Campbell, who was working for the Daily Mirror and the Independent at the time. Laurie Campbell had previously worked very closely with Clarence Mitchell, the McCann's PR representative, in covering the Soham murders case. He was then working for the BBC as a crime correspondent. It's also interesting that Leicestershire police referred Laurie Campbell not to the Portuguese police, but to the British Embassy, who, remember, helped secure the appointment of Murat as the main interpreter. Portuguese investigative journalist Paulo Reis assessed the involvement of Laurie Campbell and made these observations. On the 6th of May 2007, a female CID officer in the Leicestershire Constabulary faxed the Portugal incident room, stating that Laurie Campbell, a reporter for the Sunday Mirror, had been in contact. Laurie has been speaking to an interpreter who has been helping the Portuguese authorities with the investigation into Madeleine's disappearance. He has only given his name as Rob and has not given any background information about himself. Laurie has become suspicious of Rob as he has given conflicting accounts of various people, and he became very concerned when he noticed his photo being taken by the Mirror's photographer. Rob stated to Laurie that he was going through a messy divorce in the UK at the moment and that he had a 3-year-old daughter just like Madeleine, from whom he is separated. He made a big show of telephoning his daughter in front of reporters, and Laurie felt he was being too loud and making a big thing of it. The things that Rob said to Laurie have raised her concerns about him. Could you please call Laurie, who is still in Portugal, to establish further details to identify Rob in order to eliminate him from your inquiries? The Leicestershire police were impressively quick in forwarding Miss Campbell's information to the PJ, in stark contrast to the way they handled some other matters, such as statements made by the Gaspers about David Payne talking to Jerry McCann about asking him whether Madeleine would perform a paedophilic act. Murat then came under suspicion and the PJ intercepted his telephone, picking up some interesting chats with Martin Brunt of Sky News and a conversation with Phil, a British police officer, whom Murat asked about the ways mobile phone signals could be traced to specific locations. Mr. Murat's interest seemed to be whether such tracking would prove he was at home during the critical hours of Thursday the 3rd of May 2007. It is my opinion that Laurie Campbell is probably a British Security Services asset, and that once Murat had performed his role of whatever he did between the 1st and 4th of May, they decided, with the help of Campbell and others, to set him up as yet another patsy abductor to confuse the investigation. As the British and Portuguese police began investigating Murat, the media went to town on him, filling their front pages with their suspicions about him and generally suggesting that he was the man responsible for abducting Madeleine. Murat's backstory featured heavily in the various media accounts. Less than a year later, these newspapers had to pay him £600,000 in libel damages plus his costs. Gonçalo Amaral wrote about this in his book. He explains how on the second day after Madeleine was reported missing, Sunday the 5th of May, a Glenn Power was appointed as the British police official liaison officer attached to the British Embassy. Quite why it was necessary for any British police to get involved so quickly has never been explained. He must have been dispatched to Portugal as soon as news broke of Madeleine's disappearance. 2 days later, says Amaral, more English police officers arrived. One of them was a high-ranking officer from Leicestershire Police, Detective Chief Superintendent Bob Small, with 2 colleagues from Leicestershire. Amaral was bemused by this influx of the British police force. In his book he writes, "We insist on knowing what our English counterparts have come to Portugal to do. I assign one of my investigators to follow the English superintendent like a shadow and to keep me informed about his action. They weren't helping the Portuguese, they were actively hindering them." Amaral goes on, "Little by little, the number of English police officers grows exponentially." Again, we have to ask, as Amaral did, what were they really there for? Were they working for the British Security Services? There was a very strange parallel development in Leicestershire. It has emerged that on Tuesday the 8th of May, 5 days after Madeleine's reported disappearance, a high-powered committee consisting of top people from many government departments and Secret Service agencies was set up under the chairmanship of the then Chief Constable of Leicestershire Police, Matt Baggett. He later told the Leveson inquiry, on the 8th of May 2007, Leicestershire Constabulary was asked to coordinate the UK response to assist the Portuguese inquiry on behalf of the UK Government and Association of Chief Police Officers. A coordination group was set up on behalf of law enforcement agencies and government departments to coordinate the media interaction and ensure that a consistent stance was taken. Not to look for Madeleine then, but to coordinate the media interaction. All those law enforcement agencies and government departments tightly coordinated to control what comes out in the media. Something very big must have been at stake. Within a week, there were so many British police officers crowding in on the Portuguese police that Amaral was forced to place at their disposal a room next to our crisis unit. Describing this army of British staff, Amaral said, "Specialists from various police services, including Scotland Yard, special surveillance teams, as well as information and telecommunications technicians, all turning up with their laptops and various high-tech equipment. Many others, notably criminal profilers, British analysts, trace timelines and patterns of connections based on the witness statements gathered. They produce giant summary boards that cover the walls of the offices. They attend all our meetings and collaborate in decision-making." We now know that MI5 was interested in the case and sent representatives to Portugal. Special Branch became involved. Jim Gamble, then the head of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre, sent some of his staff. Gamble very soon called for anyone who had holidayed in Praia de Luz to send him their holiday photos. And ever since, Gamble, though no longer head of CEOP, has stood shoulder to shoulder with the McCanns at every twist and turn, and even now campaigns for them on Twitter. Amaral in his book tells us, "It was the work of these British criminal profilers who helped to put into the minds of the Portuguese police investigators that Robert Murat might be the likely abductor. Members of the British agency CEOP take a close interest in Murat and work to develop his psychological profile." Amaral had been forced to turn his attention to Murat by the huge attention being paid to him by the world's media and by the disturbing report he had received from Inspector Veranda. Amaral explains, "They have heard about the statement from one of his childhood friends, put on the file by the police department. According to him, Murat had an affirmed penchant for bestiality. Moreover, he allegedly attempted to rape his 16-year-old cousin. This individual describes Murat as someone who was violent, with behavioural problems, a sexual pervert, sadist and misanthropist. We are somewhat sceptical. All the same, according to the English profilers, there is a 90% chance that he is the guilty party." The event that clinched Amaral's decision to make Murat a formal suspect was the decision of the McCann's close friend Jane Tanner to identify Murat as the man she said she had seen carrying a child at around 9:15 p.m. on the night Madeleine was reported missing. "I dealt with this in my second Madeleine film, The Phantoms." Amaral goes on, "Murat's behaviour starts to seriously intrigue me. He often makes references to similar cases that happened in the United Kingdom and which he seems to know in detail. He displays suspicious curiosity and seeks to know more. He offers to help us identify suspects. He knows the workings of the Ocean Club and the habits of the holiday makers very well. He even tried to secretly access the investigation files. It is also known that he visits websites of a pornographic nature. His mother has set up a desk near the tapas restaurant in order to gather and give out information about Madeleine. We don't know if this woman's actions are philanthropic in nature or if she is hoping to keep well informed of all the information circling about the case. Members of the British agency CEOP take a close interest in Murat and work to develop his psychological profile. Before the search, we want to assure ourselves that Jane Tanner recognises him as the individual she saw on the night of the disappearance. She is sitting inside an unmarked car whose tinted windows allow her to see out without being spotted. The vehicle is parked at the exact spot where she says on the night of the 3rd of May, Robert Murat, anonymous amongst plainclothes police officers, goes up the road in the same way, says Tanner, as the alleged abductor. Jane Tanner is adamant. It certainly is Robert Murat that she saw that night. She definitely recognises his way of walking. Then in his book, Amaral writes, "But does he resemble the description she painted previously?" No, he doesn't. To understand why Jane Tanner made this identification of Murat, I will reveal what we now know happened just before Jane Tanner made this remarkable identification. It turns out that immediately prior to identifying Murat, she spent time with a very senior Leicestershire police officer, Detective Chief Superintendent Bob Small, but she also admits that she talked to two men from the government-backed firm Control Risks Group, Kenneth Farrow and Michael Keenan. This is how Wikipedia describes the firm. Control Risks is a global risk and strategic consulting firm specialising in political, security and integrity risk. Operating from 36 offices, the company's primary service include anti-corruption audits, consultancy and training, e-discovery, political risk analysis and a broad range of security and crisis management support. In September 2007, David Brown for The Times wrote, Kate and Jerry McCann turned to the company, which employs former members of the intelligence services and special forces, after becoming concerned that officers in the Algarve assumed their daughter was dead. A source close to the couple's legal team confirmed that Control Risks Group had been working with the family since May, but refused to discuss how the company was being paid. The idea that Control Risks Group was searching for Madeleine is ridiculous. They had zero experience in looking for missing children. All the indications are that the government was funding them and that they were an integral part of the government's attempt to cover up what really happened to Madeleine. And as Jane Tanner herself confessed, Control Risks were at the very heart of the attempt to frame Murat as the abductor. It seems highly probable that Control Risks and Bob Small were instrumental in manipulating Jane Tanner to positively identify Robert Murat as the man she said she saw carrying a child. This identification was the catalyst which made Robert Murat into an official suspect. And so it was that the police searched Murat's home on the 14th of May and took him in for questioning. It was headline news across the world. I suggest by now it is becoming clear that there was a coordinated plot to frame Robert Murat, have him arrested and made a suspect. If that is in doubt, what followed surely confirmed it. During the 2 days that followed Murat being made a suspect, no fewer than 3 members of the Tapas 7 suddenly remembered that they had seen Robert Murat hanging around near the McCann's apartment, talking to some of the group soon after Madeleine was reported missing. According to Rachel Oldfield, one of the Tapas 7, she said she saw Murat on a Sky News report and immediately claimed to Jane Tanner that she had seen Murat on the night of the 3rd of May near the Ocean Club. Fiona Payne, another Tapas 7 friend of the McCanns, then said the same. And then Dr. Russell O'Brien said he also had actually met Murat on the night of the 3rd of May. He later changed that, however, and claimed he'd met Murat the following morning, and actually put Murat's phone number into his mobile list of contacts. 2 days after Murat was made a suspect, Rachel Oldfield, Fiona Payne and Dr. Russell O'Brien all made statements to the police which put Murat close to the scene of the alleged abduction on the night in question. This would have confirmed to Amaral and his team that they were on the right track. But Gonçalo Amaral was suspicious about their statements, so decided to arrange for the 3 Tapas 7 members to meet with Robert Murat in a tiny room kneecap to kneecap in the Portimao police station on the 11th of July. He wrote, "A confrontation is organised between the witnesses. Nothing new comes out of it. The former persist in stating that the suspect was definitely in the area on the night of the disappearance. Murat denies the whole thing and even accuses them of lying. Each side stands its ground." In the coming months, 5 other people also remembered having seen Murat near the McCann's apartment that night. That is according to newspaper reports probably sourced from the McCann's PR spokesman Clarence Mitchell. The Daily Mail named the 5 as including holidaymaker Jane Jensen, an unnamed British barrister, and 2 people that had contacted the McCann's investigation hotline. But then, in 2008, not long after Amaral was removed from the investigation, several of the 8 people who said they remembered seeing Murat suddenly admitted they might have been confused with another person, either David Payne or Angus Symington, one of the owners of the Ocean Club, who was said to resemble Murat. The Daily Mail said, "Doubt was cast on the evidence of several key witnesses in the Madeleine McCann disappearance last night. Those who said they saw suspect Robert Murat outside the family's holiday apartment on the night she vanished may have named the wrong man, it was revealed. Detectives believe the witnesses who said they saw the British expat could have confused him with a friend of Kate and Jerry McCann, David Payne, who was out searching for the missing 3-year-old. A series of witnesses had given statements claiming to have seen him around the Ocean Club apartment complex in the hours after Mrs. McCann, 39, raised the alarm. They included 3 friends of the McCanns, Russell O'Brien, Fiona Payne and Rachel Oldfield. It looks to me as though it was convenient and helpful to the McCanns to have the attention focused on Murat as a suspect. But several months later, it seems to have been convenient to drop Murat as a suspect. This may have occurred because of a crucial meeting held on the 13th of November 2007, which I'll come to in a moment. I should just add that in April 2008, the Tappers 3, Rachel Oldfield, Fiona Payne and Russell O'Brien, were re-questioned at Enderby, Leicestershire Police Headquarters by Leicestershire Police on the instructions of the Portuguese police. All were re-questioned in some depth about their claims of speaking with Robert Murat on the evening of the 3rd of May. Rachel Oldfield and Fiona Payne stuck to their story, but Russell O'Brien admitted that he had only seen Murat on the morning after and not the night before. There's one more episode that we need to look at, which I mentioned briefly in my first Madeleine film, and that's the moment Jerry McCann was asked by an interviewer, "Did you already know Robert Murat?"
Jerry McCann negou conhecê-lo.
But did you know Robert Murat?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Os avanços no processo podem ditar novos interrogatórios ao casal McCann, que deve voltar a Portimão no final desta semana.
In my opinion, it is a real possibility that Jerry McCann had previously met Murat, and that would be hugely significant. Many news organisations from many countries covered the Madeleine McCann case. Sky News gave the case intensive coverage. Their man in Pride of Luz was their chief crime correspondent, Martin Brunt. I'm going to take a brief look now at the 2 phone calls Brunt made to Robert Murat. The first, secretly recorded by the Portuguese police and published by them in August 2008, took place on the 15th of May, the day after Murat had been made a suspect. His mother, Jennifer Murat, picked up the call. It went like this.
Hello, residents of Jenny Murat. Hello, Martin Brunt speaking. Hi, dear. Hi, is everything all right? Yes, Robert is a little depressed now. I'm sure he is. It wasn't very nice of Sky News to refer to him as our Guido, don't you think? I didn't see that. I was up at our house. What are they saying in regard to that? Robert Murat has been made an arguido in the case of Madeleine McCann. What does the term arguido mean in Portuguese? What does the term arguido mean, Robert? Suspect. Suspect. Okay, well, I'm not completely familiar with the legal Portuguese terms. I think that someone said that the police said they were treating Robert as an arguido. Robert as an arguido? What I mean is, what is that? I'm going to pass you to Robert. Don't hang up, Martin. Okay, thanks. Hello, Martin. Hello, Robert. Your number didn't show up. That's why I didn't know who it was. Oh, I didn't send you my number. That's okay. Well, I will see if I manage not to lose this one, if I can find the tool. Okay, we will try. I have not seen it yet, but we will try to explain. The police say, or was it the local journalists who say, you should be treated as an arguido, that he is a suspect, basically. Yes, well, even so, given the tone of the interrogation, and the fact of being free, which says a lot about the interest in you, eh? That is the same as finishing me off. It was not me. I didn't do anything. And now I am literally, okay, I know, I think. It's always on when I turn the TV on, and even now. Yes, well, it would be better to turn it off. Really, to have been quiet was the best thing I could have done. Yes, but when I turn the television on, I think, they are going to finish me completely. They are finishing me off. Okay, I'm going to tell you that in order to have an idea. I'll tell you what we're going to do. Did you talk to the lawyer? 2 things. We talked to the Sky lawyer, right, who was of the opinion that according to what you signed, you reported your work as being that of a translator. certainly. As far as the thing is that it was, it probably is. Oh, go on, continue. We talked to a Sky lawyer, but the problem with the Sky lawyer is that he is English. Yes, no. He is our lawyer. And you can see, he said what it seemed to be to him. According to his understanding. According to his understanding, exactly. And now we are reluctant to talk to the lawyer who contacted you. That's right, okay? We do not know him, okay? And you do not know him. Well, you don't? Exactly, that's right. I do not know him, mate. And we do not know where he came from or what his credibility is. Yes, and they told us that the police were going to play games with false leads, and that was why, and who knows whether he is who he says he is. That's right, okay. And he could be trying to test you out, or hoping that we pass him some information. Certainly. We know that you suspect your calls are being listened to because of this. Right. Because of this reason we are very reluctant, because we do not know him, and you do not know him. But however, I mean, the best option you have to come clean with this would probably be to go with a lawyer from Lisbon. Someone from up there, not from the Algarve. It would have to be someone from Lisbon. Is that okay? That's okay. I will try and arrange for someone from there. But, okay. But our position in relation to all this, for the moment, as I have explained previously, is that we consider ourselves to be very important, and I think it was your opinion initially to do something finally that would manage to be on your side. Yes, and that would not lead to my being detained immediately. Of course, and you know many of the things that you told me were not attributed to me. I understand, and I don't want to enter into all those details, and we did not do anything since I left you. No. I'm sure you understand. Yes. And if there is anything that better clarifies that you think you could say, that could also be used in the future, of course. You know, you could quote Sky sources and others. Yes, that would be perfect. That would be just perfect. But I think it is important that you should have the media there, and if we could appear briefly and make statements in these terms. I was questioned, it was a vague questioning, I was not asked direct questions about Madeleine, and afterwards you explained to me how you felt that they made you a scapegoat, that you have nothing to hide even if your computer is analysed, and at the end of the day you will be absolved, and they will find the true abductor or kidnapper. You could. Let's first look at this with a Portuguese lawyer. We will, won't we? Yes, no. Are you going to do this? I will do my best to arrange for one now. Yes. But independently of what the lawyer thinks, I think that this is the clearest option. But we will have to try to find someone who... Yes, I think this is the simplest. Can you confirm this? I am here having a family discussion to see what they think. Ah, yes, of course I will. But I'm talking about making very clear statements. Yes, okay. That they do not enter into many details, but into the way you can get your message across. Get it across, okay. That you give your version of events, given that the only version of events is vague, and yes, and that the two local journalists and everyone are against you, and that there is nobody, with the exception of my interview with Sally, yes, there has nobody who has spoken in favour of Robert Murat because of this. In fact, of the many interviews given, I have heard that there were some positive ones, people contradicting each other. Yes, they arrived and said, no, they have been very positive about this. Of course, people from the area, people from here, exactly. Who know what happened? Many people from the area said very positive things about this, about me, which is useful. Of course. Well, I will see what I can find and get back in touch with you. Okay, bye. And if we agree on this, yes, and if we could agree to appear for 15 minutes, I never have any problem with making a statement. Okay, I have no problem with that, whilst I have the legal cover to do so, because I don't want to end up in prison. That would be the last thing we want. Firstly, for something I did not do, and secondly, for something that would break their contract rules. I understand that, and I understand the sensitive nature of everything that we have been working with since we arrived here. So, okay, can I phone you again in half an hour? Goodbye. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
So in this phone call, we have evidence that the Murats and Martin Brunt are on familiar terms. Murat calls Brunt mate. Also, we note that Brunt has a house in Praia de Luz, something he has confirmed elsewhere. Evidently, Brunt and Murat had already been talking before his arrest, For example, about the help Brunt was offering from Sky News' legal department. But most significant is where Murat says, "I don't want to go to prison," and gives two reasons. One, he never did it, but also for something that would break their contract rules. Immediately, Brunt realises that Murat has touched on a very sensitive subject and replies, using very guarded language, "I understand the sensitive nature of everything that we have been working with since we arrived here." Murat refers to a contract. What sort of contract is that? Who is the contract with? What are its terms? Murat apparently thinks he might be breaking some contract rules by being interviewed by Martin Brunt. Brunt refers to the sensitive nature of the issue about the contract. He then refers to everything that we've been working with since we arrived here. So what exactly is everything we have been working with? And for how long have they been working with this thing? Well, Brunt says, since we arrived here. When did Sky News and Brunt arrive in Pride of Luz? Well, Sky News was there the very first day Madeleine was reported missing, the 4th of May. What were they discussing? I've covered Murat in detail because I suggest he is a key part of the whole story, although it's clear he was in England when I suggest Madeleine actually died. I suggest from all of the evidence we've looked at so far, Murat was called over to Portugal on behalf of government security services to help plan the abduction hoax that took place at around 10 p.m. on the 3rd of May. I suggest he was already known to security services. I suggest in some capacity he already knew Gerry McCann. In my opinion, his roles probably included, firstly, finding a property with a freezer where Madeleine's body could be conveniently stored and assisting in taking it there. Secondly, volunteering to act as an interpreter. And thirdly, whilst an interpreter, finding out all he could and also suggesting bogus lines of inquiry. It's clear to me he was then framed, but was he willingly framed? On balance, I think this is very possible. One of the reasons I suggest this is that he agreed to be interviewed by the Portuguese police without exercising his right to have a solicitor present to advise him. Yet he comprehensively lied during this first interview. I think he must have known or had good reason to believe that he would be protected. I suggest he was a known security services asset, probably to MI5, and deliberately participated in a complex plot to create an abduction scenario. It follows from that, if the security services were involved in this cover-up, as I demonstrated they were in my first Madeleine film, then in some way, which I will come to in a moment, the reason for their involvement must have been to hide some particularly illegal and or immoral activity that would threaten the UK government if its existence became known. Before leaving the subject of Robert Murat, I want to look at a highly unusual meeting that took place on the 13th of November 2007 at the Villa Salsalitas, owned by Robert Murat's aunt and uncle, Ralph and Sally Everleigh. Present at this meeting were 5 people from what I call the Murat camp, and 2 from the McCann camp. Let's remember at this time the McCanns had been made formal suspects over 2 months previously. There were now 3 suspects, Robert Murat, Gerry McCann and Kate McCann. Let's also recall that exactly 6 weeks before this meeting, Gonçalo Amaral had been removed from the investigation due to diplomatic pressure from the UK government and apparently replaced by a puppet, Paolo Robello, whose job appeared to be to quietly close down the investigation. So who was at this meeting? In the Murat camp, Robert Murat, Ralph Everleigh, Murat's uncle, Sally Everleigh, Murat's aunt, Jennifer Murat, Murat's mother, and Francisco Pagaret, Murat's lawyer. In the McCann camp, Brian Kennedy, the Cheshire businessman worth around £250 million, one of Britain's richest people, who directed the Find Madeleine investigation and appointed all the dodgy investigation agencies that I covered in my first Madeleine film. And Edward Smethurst, senior Freemason and past Grand Master of the East Lancashire Masonic Province, the man who has acted as the McCann's coordinating solicitor throughout, and who has been a director of the Find Madeleine Fund since 2009. Smethurst is also alleged to have holidayed every year in Praia de Luz since 1999. Is that just a coincidence? On both sides then, big guns were employed. The meeting was intended to be secret. But when news of it was leaked to the Portuguese press 2 weeks later, Brian Kennedy said the purpose of the meeting was for him to offer Murat a job looking for Madeleine. I believe that was a lie. So what was this meeting really about? 4 members of the Tapper 7 had effectively accused Murat of being involved. Jane Tanner had even said he was the actual abductor. The first thing that stands out is the McCann team must have known that Murat was not the abductor. Otherwise, why send Kennedy and Smethurst to meet him? I suggest this was a planning meeting between the two camps. Something had gone wrong when Madeleine unexpectedly died around the second day of the McCann's holiday. Murat, I suggest, had been actively involved in the subsequent cover-up. I keep in mind the possibility that Murat was not a willing patsy, but whether he was or not, I suggest that the purpose of this meeting was to strike some sort of deal. That is perhaps why top lawyers were involved on both sides. The events that followed soon after this meeting are very interesting. Just 4 days later, the Tapper 7 and an array of lawyers and PR agents, including of course Clarence Mitchell, met for a day-long get-together at the Rothley Court Hotel, just down the road from the McCann's house. When news of that meeting leaked out, Clarence Mitchell said it was just a friendly reunion. Anything that comes out of Mitchell's mouth, in my opinion, must immediately be assumed to be a lie unless evidence can be found which shows it to be true. Then weeks later, several people changed their stories about Murat, saying they'd probably mixed him up with someone else. Just weeks after that, Murat started libel proceedings in the High Court and was very shortly handed over £600,000 in an out-of-court settlement, which was rapidly agreed to by several print and TV media. A few weeks after Murat netted £600,000, the McCanns achieved another £550,000 in another out-of-court settlement. Interviewed days after this huge payout, Murat appeared to display no trace of anger at people like Jane Tanner and the other friends of the McCanns who had previously accused him of being the abductor. This strange interview was analysed by the criminologist who runs the popular Eyes for Lies website. She gives clear reasons why she believes Murat is lying in this interview. He seems not the least bothered about having been falsely accused of abducting Madeleine McCann. This, in my opinion, shows he was probably a willing patsy.
I would like to emphasise that I strongly believe in freedom of speech. I don't have a problem somebody purporting a theory, writing fiction, suggestions.
So, how did Madeleine McCann die? There are many theories, but let me set out as I see it the three main alternatives. Alternative 1. Madeleine died as a result of an overdose or sedatives or other drugs, either cumulatively, over time, or administered on that holiday. Alternative 2. Madeleine died in a freak accident, either when the McCanns were present or when they were not present. If the death was an accident, there needs to be a reason for the cover-up. If the McCanns were not present, the accident could have been covered up to conceal the McCanns' negligence. Or an autopsy might reveal previous ill treatment of Madeleine, for example, the use of sedative drugs or physical or sexual abuse. Or because there was a mystery about her true parents, i.e. she was not the true daughter of both parents, or she was a surrogate or was adopted. Alternative 3 is that Madeleine was the subject of an unprovoked assault by either parent or possibly someone else that killed her. Whatever the cause of death, were the McCanns and their group of friends connected in some way with a high-level paedophile ring, and perhaps that is why her death was covered up? Were the McCanns able to call in favours? This, by the way, was the exact phrase used by Kate McCann's uncle, Brian Kennedy, who lived in the same village as the McCanns. According to a report in the Daily Mail, Brian Kennedy spoke of how the family were calling in some favours. Or was there some other secret which bound the McCanns and the Tapper 7 together? That will lead me on to discuss whether on that holiday Madeleine could have been passed to a paedophile to abuse her and died during that encounter. I'm going to start by looking at the hypothesis that Madeleine died by some sort of drugs overdose, maybe sedatives. There are a number of indications that this, at the very least, may be a factor. I've made heavy use of analysis of the subject by a former police superintendent known on the internet as Peter Mack. If you look at the accounts Kate McCann has given of her immediate reactions to Madeleine being missing, she speaks of having yelled, hitting out at things, banging my fists on the railings, running from pillar to post, throwing open, hurtling out, started screaming, was hysterical, and so on. It is surprising then, if the twins really were there during these events, that they did not wake up. I wandered into the children's bedroom several times to check Sean and Emily. They were both lying there on their fronts in a kind of crouch, with their heads turned sideways and their knees tucked under their tummies. In spite of the noise and lights and general pandemonium, they hadn't stirred. They had always been sound sleepers, but this seemed unnatural. Scared for them too, I placed the palms of my hand on their backs to check for chest movement, basically for some sign of life. Had Madeleine been given some kind of sedative to keep her quiet? Had the twins too? Fiona Payne, in her statement, claimed that Kate had put a finger under the children's noses to test for breathing. But what is absent is any sense of urgency, of rousing them to make sure they were alive and breathing. Is the account of the twins doubled up in a crouching position fabricated? Perhaps created to suggest that the abductor could have sedated them? It is stated that at some point friends carried the still sleeping twins to another apartment. There is no proof at all that the twins were even in the McCann's apartment that evening. The Portuguese police report of the 10th of September 2007 was clear in saying that the crime scene in the children's bedroom had been arranged. The police who spoke to Kate McCann on the 3rd of August said, "She now presumes that they were under the effect of some sedative drug that a presumed abductor had administered to the 3 children in order to be able to abduct Madeleine," a situation which Kate refers to being possible. In a TV programme in 2009, Gonçalo Amaral was asked, "Do you think the children were sedated?" He answered, "There is no doubt. Kate called a colleague of mine on or about the 10th of August to ask the PJ to check the twins for traces of sedation. Kate was apparently alone when she called, and a bit upset. But that same afternoon, Jerry called and cancelled the request." Up until that date, more than 3 months after Madeleine was reported missing, the McCanns had not previously asked the police to carry out toxicology tests on the children. Then Kate asks, but Jerry later the same day cancelled her request. Several weeks later, though, the McCanns organised their own drug tests on the children, which took place on the 24th of September 2007. That was very nearly 5 months after Madeleine's reported disappearance. It allowed enough time for most drug toxins to have long since been eliminated from their bodies. Moreover, it was someone from the government-backed, highly questionable Control Risks Group who arranged to carry out the tests. The McCanns didn't initially volunteer the scientific results, but in the end, an Indian newspaper, Dajé, established that a company called Tricotest had performed the analysis. Kate McCann stated in her book, all the hair samples produced negative results. While this didn't totally exclude the possibility that the children had been sedated, especially given the time that had elapsed, it meant nobody else, including the PJ and the media, could prove otherwise. Nobody else could prove otherwise. The result eventually announced on the 20th of October that no scientific evidence of sedative drugs or other drugs was found was welcomed a few days later by Jerry McCann, who, once again, emphatically denied they had ever used sedatives. He told The Sun, "It's ludicrous. These sorts of questions are nonsense, and we shouldn't be giving them the light of day. There is absolutely no suggestion that Madeleine or the children were drugged. It's outrageous." But strangely, despite that finding, the McCanns and those around them kept on promoting the idea that all 3 children might have been sedated by the abductor. For example, on the 2nd of October, Susan Healy, Kate's mother, claimed that Madeleine had been drugged by her abductor. Jerry McCann claimed on the 19th of November, the twins were still sleeping in their cots, so we tried to leave it as undisturbed as possible, and they slept very soundly until we moved them out of their cots into another apartment. Which does make you wonder if there was any substances used to keep them asleep. Diane Webster, the mother of one of the Tapper 7, told Leicestershire Police in 2008, the twins were still asleep in the cot, and with all the noise going on, I don't know how they slept through it, which makes me think they must have been drugged with something by the abductor. I think Madeleine would have been drugged as well. Later, on the 10th of April 2008, Fiona Payne said, "But the twins were okay. I mean, they were fine. They were asleep, but at the time it did seem weird. They didn't wake up, and again, that was quite strange. Even in the transfer and being handled by people that weren't their parents, they didn't wake up." Later still, October 2009, 2 former detectives employed by the McCanns, Dave Edgar and Arthur Cowley, told a newspaper that they were convinced the abductor went to the family's apartment on May the 3rd, 2007, fully prepared with sufficient drugs, probably chloroform, to knock out all 3 children. The fact that Sean and Amelie, just over 2 years old, failed to wake when the alarm was raised, nor even as they were taken to another apartment in the cold night air, has persuaded the detectives that they too must have been drugged. And in a serialisation by the Sun newspaper of Kate's book, we read that Kate McCann said the kidnapper who seized Madeleine may also have drugged her other 2 children, as she launched a new appeal in the hunt for her missing girl today. She said she had to check that the twins, Sean and Amelie, were still breathing because they did not wake as they began a frantic search for the missing 3-year-old. We must ask why the McCanns kept on repeating the "they were sedated" mantra, and bear in mind that I believe the McCanns know there was no abduction. Both Kate McCann and her doctor friend Fiona Payne were both qualified anaesthetists. If so, surely they would be able to distinguish the difference between a child which was merely asleep and one that had been heavily sedated. Could the McCanns themselves have been sedating the children? Kate's father, Brian Healy, in a TV interview conceded that, "I think they may have used Calpol, like most mothers."
In that evening, did you give to your kids something like Calpol to help them sleep?
We're not going to comment on anything, but, there is absolutely no way we used any sedative drugs or anything like that. And, you know, we have cooperated fully with the police. We'll answer any queries, any tests that they want to do.
On the date he was made a formal suspect, Jerry McCann stated, "When we travelled to Portugal, we brought several medicines, namely Calpol, Nurofen for fevers and pains, both for adults and children, Losec for gastric problems he occasionally suffers from, and an antihistamine called terfenadine for hay fever. I didn't give any of these medicines or any others to the children while on holiday in Portugal." The terfenadine was left unsecured in a low-level piece of furniture in the parents' bedroom. It had the US brand name Seldane on the packet. It is a risky drug capable of producing dangerous heart issues such as heart arrhythmia and can be lethal if combined with grapefruit juice. It has been withdrawn from several countries. Some speculated that these had been given to Madeleine or that she had got hold of some of these tablets herself, mistaking them for sweets. How should we interpret all this? We have a family member telling an interviewer that the McCanns may have used Calpol, yet Jerry McCann unconvincingly denies this. Then we have efforts to accuse an abductor of sedating all 3 children. A syringe lying close to some tranquilizers and surgical gloves was found in the villa where the McCanns stayed after leaving apartment 5A. A Portuguese police report reads, "Were the children sedated?" Kate McCann, via the Portuguese police inspector who acted as liaison officer for the family, asked on the 10th of August why samples weren't taken from the twins in order to test the hypothesis that they had been sedated. She knew well enough at that time, more than 3 months later, that such an examination would be worthless. However, she went further and said that we, the investigation, should verify that the abductor had sedated Madeleine in order to accomplish his action, and that he had also sedated the twins as to be able to abduct them as well. But she didn't bring up these things at the appropriate time. What we know for certain is that the sedatives have periods in which to act as a sedative, and timings at which they are normally completely expelled from the body that vary between 6 and 200 hours. The McCann's medical knowledge is enough to know this. I suggest that the McCanns did at least use Calpol and possibly other sedatives. Madeleine, we are told in many reports, was a very lively child. Therefore, is it possible that Madeleine was given an excessive dose of something, say on the Sunday night, and died later? A number of other possibilities have been suggested to account for the McCanns' persistent angst about sedatives in this case. One is the suggestion that the McCanns and their doctor friends on that holiday might have been carrying out covert medical research on some new sedative drug, or that the McCanns had some connection with one or more major pharmaceutical company. Another suggestion is that Madeleine might have died from a Ritalin overdose. Jerry McCann's elder brother, John McCann, worked for major pharmaceutical firm AstraZeneca. In the days after Madeleine was reported missing, acting as a family spokesman, he announced that AstraZeneca had given him indefinite leave from his job. This seemed rather drastic, but at that time there was still presumably hope that Madeleine could be found alive any day. The Times on the 22nd of May 2007 reported, "Gordon Brown has pledged his support. Last Friday, John McCann was dining with his friends when Downing Street called to say that the Chancellor was on the line. Minutes later, Mr McCann's mobile, on which he takes hundreds of calls daily, ran out of power, cutting off Britain's next Prime Minister in mid-sentence. Yesterday morning, as Mr McCann was talking to the Times, his mobile rang again. It was Revenue and Customs calling at Mr Brown's request to discuss how the fund could gain charitable status. The campaign has 2 nerve centres, one in Pride of Luz. The other is the Glasgow sitting room of John McCann, 48, who is on indefinite leave from his job as a medical rep for the pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca. There he fields endless emails and telephone calls." Various medicines were found in the villa the McCanns were staying in from July to September 2007. The issue of drugs and sedatives continued to be raised and caused an angry reaction from Kate McCann in 2012, 5 years later. The Daily Express reported Kate McCann's angry attack on alleged lies in a Spanish TV documentary on the case over drugs that were found in their holiday apartment and later in the villa they moved to in July 2007. The drugs found in the villa, she said, were simply drugs for Parkinson's disease, which her father Brian Healy suffered from. As for Ritalin, one viewer who has seen my films asked if Madeleine could have died from a Ritalin overdose. Ritalin is frequently prescribed by doctors for the condition known as ADD or ADHD for hyperactive children. This viewer gave me some alarming statistics on how many children are routinely prescribed this drug and about the vast profits made by its manufacturers. I've looked up some references to Ritalin, and there have certainly been a worrying number of child deaths caused by Ritalin, numbered in the hundreds if not thousands, and there is allegedly evidence that coroners have colluded in minimising the number of child deaths attributed to Ritalin. But the problem is we do not have a body. The toxicology checks on the twins didn't take place for nearly 5 months and so were worthless. Whether sedation played at least a part in Madeleine's death can't be established, but can by no means be ruled out. I now come to the freak accident theory, which was the one advanced by Gonçalo Amaral and the PJ Inspector Tavares de Almeida, who wrote a report on the case on the 10th of September 2007, 3 days after the McCanns were declared suspects. He concluded, the minor, Madeleine McCann, died in apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia de Luz on the night of the 3rd of May 2007. At this moment, there seems to be no strong indications that the child's death was other than the result of a tragic accident. Now, there is evidence that Madeleine's death could be associated with loss of blood. We know that the smell of corpse odour was found in 12 places associated with the McCanns, in the apartment, in the car, on Kate's clothes, etc. Blood or body fluids were found in 5 of those locations. I appreciate that the second round of forensic tests conducted by the Forensic Science Service were inconclusive, allegedly because of contamination, and that the blood and body fluids only might be Madeleine's. We know the first set of results seemed to be a clear indication that the body fluids were from Madeleine, albeit from low copy DNA, but that result was superseded by the Forensic Science Service report. I want to focus on the very strong alert that the dogs gave to the area below the window in the McCann's apartment lounge. The cadaver dog Eddie gave a major immediate alert here. The blood dog found blood or body fluids in the exact same spot. In fact, there was a sufficient quantity of body fluids for one of the tiles in the corner to be lifted, where more body fluids were found. There is every possibility that, during a period between Madeleine's death occurring and an abduction being announced, the apartment had been thoroughly cleaned. So if there was an accident, this looks like the spot where it might have happened. For that reason, a common suggestion is that Madeleine might have fallen off the sofa and banged her head so hard that she died from her injuries. It was a hard, tiled surface. However, I consider the possibility of a fatal accident occurring from such an accidental fall to be unlikely. Let us assume first that it happened whilst the McCanns were in the apartment. Accidents do happen and may sometimes be fatal. If it was such an unfortunate accident, why would they not inform the hospital straight away, even if she had died? It is a crime to conceal a body. An explanation that she had been playing around and banged her head on the floor would probably be accepted, unless, that is, her injuries were not consistent just with an accident. However, the position would be rather different if, say, Madeleine and the twins had been left on their own in the evening. The accident happened soon after they left, and they had not got back until the early hours of the morning. If this was the case, rigor mortis might have set in, and therefore the hospital and the police might ask them searching questions about why it took them so long to find that Madeleine was dead. In that scenario, the presumption of a significant degree of negligence would arise, with prosecution being a real risk. So that might have made the McCanns decide to attempt to cover up. There is a third possibility, namely that there was indeed an accident, but that if Madeleine's body was presented for an autopsy, the authorities would discover something that the McCanns would desperately want hidden. The following suggestions have been made. There might be pre-existing signs of physical abuse. There might be pre-existing signs of sexual abuse. A toxicology report might reveal signs of past sedatives or other drugs in her system, or her medical records or an analysis of her DNA might reveal something that the McCanns wanted hidden. The following suggestions within this have been put forward: that she was adopted, or a surrogate child, or was not the child of both parents, or even that she was the product of some genetic engineering project, perhaps a clone. On the subject of possible physical or sexual abuse, we have a range of photographs and videos of Madeleine which the McCanns have put into the public domain. Generally, they show a happy, active, talkative child. Crucially, we also have 3 photographs of Madeleine which, as I showed in my last Madeleine film, were most possibly taken on the first day of the McCanns' holiday, Saturday the 28th of April. These show a happy, lively young girl enjoying her holiday. Whilst signs of abuse are not always easy to spot, there is no real evidence of Madeleine looking unhappy, poorly fed, or unwell in any way. There is, however, one exception to that, and that's this photo, the so-called makeup photo, which seems to have been taken near the end of her life, which I will come back to later. The third possible cause of death I suggested was the possibility of an unprovoked violent assault. A sudden loss of temper, perhaps by either of the parents or possibly by a third party. One reason for suggesting this is that such an event would create a much more powerful incentive for the McCanns to cover up Madeleine's death. Her injuries might prove that violence or excessive force was used, more than would result from an accident. The body fluids, including blood, found under the living room tiles is another potential indicator that a violent death may have occurred, possibly Madeleine being thrown against the wall or the floor, for example. In the bottom right of this picture, you can see where the removed floor tiles were. Also in this picture, you can see several spots, numbered up to 13 on the walls. Altogether, the Portuguese police located 16 spots in the living room where they were able to obtain a sample of DNA from body fluids. 10 of these, numbers 4 to 13, were on the walls, 3 on the floor, 2 on the back of the sofa, and 1 elsewhere. Some have referred to the 15 spots on the wall, floor, and back of the sofa as showing spatters of Madeleine's blood. We cannot say that on the basis of the Portuguese analysis. One spot was matched with the DNA of a previous occupant, Sally Gordon. The Portuguese compared the swabs with 280 local residents whose DNA might conceivably have been deposited in the apartment, but there were no other matches. There was not enough DNA on most of the swabs to attempt to try and match the DNA with Madeleine's. In any event, the spatters are so widespread that they would have resulted from a very violent blow, which would surely have left a lot more blood everywhere. So, despite claims by some that these might be blood spatters from Madeleine, the evidence is simply not there. But that by no means excludes the possibility of a violent event having happened. Something we should look at, therefore, is whether there is any propensity for violence in either parent. Starting with Kate McCann, here are some quotes from her own book on the night when she claims Madeleine was abducted. "I was overwhelmed by fear, helplessness and frustration. I was hitting out at things, banging my fists on the metal railing of the veranda. The frustration and anger were reaching boiling point. I felt like a caged, demented animal. Finally, I erupted. I began to scream, swear and lash out. I kicked an extra bed that had been brought into the apartment and smashed the end right off it." And here are 3 other quotes from later on in the holiday. "My frustration with their lack of progress whipped up a storm of fury in me that was completely out of character. It seems to me now as if for several months I was possessed by some demonic alien that infiltrated my thoughts and filled me with anger and hatred. I needed a face on which to pin all this rage. My incredulity turned to rage. How dare they suggest I lie? My anger and ferocious maternal instinct began to permeate Jerry's despair. Keeping a lid on my anger, within seconds I was a raging lioness. I was incensed. My anger was bubbling below the surface. I felt such disdain, I found myself whispering, "Fucking tosser, fucking tosser." Later, Kate was to write of the Portuguese police detective Gonçalo Amaral, "He deserves to be miserable and feel fear." I wanted to inflict the maximum pain possible on him for heaping all this on us. Yet strangely, of the person who abducted her child, she was able to say, "I can probably forgive Maddie's abductor. I don't want to be eaten up by hatred." We know newspaper headlines cannot usually be believed, especially in this case, but I've noted how many of them over the years have mentioned the McCann's fury, anger and rage. So it seems there is evidence that both Kate and possibly Jerry McCann might be capable of being temperamental, furious and angry. Another concern about Kate McCann was revealed early on when one of the McCann's relatives volunteered the surprising information, which I have not yet verified, that there was always someone with Kate when Jerry was frequently away from home on holidays or on business. I believe it was a suggestion that she was possibly at risk to herself and others if on her own with the children, but as I said, I have not got this confirmed. The Portuguese police asked several questions concerning how Kate dealt with the children. What was Madeleine's behaviour? Did Maddie suffer any disease, or did she take any kind of medication? What was the relationship like between Madeleine and her siblings, her friends and her colleagues at school? In England, did you give your children medication? What type of medication? Do your twin children have difficulty in falling asleep? Are they unruly, and does this upset you? Is it true that at certain times you were desperate over your children's behaviour and that caused you to be upset? Is it true that in England you considered the possibility of handing over Madeleine's guardianship to a relative? Kate refused to answer all of these questions, as she did with 40 other questions she was asked, exercising her legal right to silence. However Madeleine died or was killed, it seems probable that her injuries or condition were serious enough to be covered up. The presence of a quantity of body fluids under the living room tiles that had to be removed would suggest that at least the possibility that a violent act may have been responsible for Madeleine's death. That seems more likely to me than an accidental fall from a settee. Let us suppose for a moment that Madeleine died either from an accident or from a violent act, and that in either case the McCanns decided to cover it up. Most people would then ask, as many have done, why on earth would the Tapas 7 help them cover it up? True, they were all quite close friends, especially the McCanns and the Paynes. True, they were all doctors, apart from two of the wives. But would that be enough for them to tell lies and all agree to go along with an elaborate abduction hoax? A charade intended to deceive the police? I believe the evidence suggests that they did help the McCanns to cover up Madeleine's death, as I showed in my first Madeleine film. So there must surely be more to it. And that brings me to the fourth option I want to consider. Namely, were the McCanns connected in any way with a paedophile ring? Or, even worse, was Madeleine passed to a paedophile to be abused and died during an encounter with him? No one can doubt that the possibility that Madeleine had been abducted by a paedophile was raised right from the outset, not least by the McCanns themselves. It was on the very first night when the alarm about Madeleine being missing was raised that the McCanns themselves first suggested that paedophiles snatched Madeleine. The Portuguese police files contain hundreds of witness statements. One was Graham Mackenzie, and this is his account of events at about 11 p.m. to midnight an hour or two after the McCanns had reported Madeleine missing. I approached the McCanns' apartment from the bushes at the rear of the apartment. I did not know it was the McCanns' apartment at the time. I was searching in the little gardens on the pool side of that block. I was in the end garden. I heard and saw Jerry McCann standing alone in the doorway at the rear of the apartment on the balcony/patio about 3 meters away, talking on his mobile. Dr. McCann was looking over the swimming pool and did not see me. Dr. McCann was absolutely distraught, his voice cracking with emotion, telling the person receiving the call that he feared she, Madeleine McCann, had been taken by paedophiles and that there were paedophile gangs in the area and that they had abducted Madeleine. I do not know who the person receiving the call was, but presume it was a family member or someone he was very close to due to the nature of his conversation. I was so shocked by this, having originally thought that she had just wandered off. I think we need to contemplate this statement from the perspective that Madeleine was already dead and that Jerry McCann was fully aware of this. So it was Jerry McCann himself who was apparently telling people he feared Madeleine had been taken by one or more paedophiles. He was the first off the blocks to offer up this word. The media instantly took up the theme, with many newspapers giving accounts of other snatches by paedophiles. But none of these very rare snatches by paedophiles remotely resembled the McCann's scenario. In the months that followed her claimed disappearance, the McCann team went on to make numerous references, counted in dozens, to the probability that Madeleine had been abducted by paedophiles. So-called experts on child sexual abuse and paedophilia soon appeared in the press and on TV to pronounce on their theories on the case. I want to mention two of them: the late Ray Wire, founder of the Gracewell Clinic for treating sex offenders, and Mark Williams Thomas, a former police officer, self-styled criminologist and TV pundit.
You have evidence to back up stories like Teresa's, that this is
Yes.
really happening?
Well, we have that age of child, 6, 5 and 4, giving information that ties up with Teresa. How do those children know? How do those children able to describe rituals, to talk about ceremonies, to talk about sacrificing animals? How do those children know?
Nightmares, imagining it?
You can't imagine those things.
Less than 1 week after Madeleine was reported missing, the Daily Telegraph published an article by Wire on the case. I have worked with men who have abducted and killed children. Often their capture has failed to save the child and has not come about through good police work. The planning needed to take the child cannot be overestimated. It was clear from the beginning in Portugal that we were dealing with an abduction and the need to think offender was essential. What was his motivation? How would he initiate contact and target the child? How would he control the environment to evade discovery? Portuguese police cannot ignore the UK's experience in such cases. In the early 90s, a British paedophile group filmed the sexual abuse of Portuguese boys. At one stage, the Americans were so concerned about the role of British paedophiles in Portugal that I was approached about the targeting of schools there. International cooperation should be part of police thinking. However, there is no culture of community policing in Portugal, and they have laws that prevent the discussion of cases. This is clearly the wrong way around. The media are essential in passing coordinated and directed information to the community. In this case, speculation is rife. Confused messages are likely to be given. The parents will be feeling guilty for leaving the children, and even half an hour is a long time if a child wakes up and starts to cry immediately after one leaves the room. This could possibly lead to a woman on her own who has lost a child saying to herself wrongly that the parents did not care for this child and deciding to take the girl home. No paedophile, no conspiracy, just a lonely woman. The window of opportunity for the abductor means that the information given by the parents has to be very accurate. Police must help them to say exactly how long it was since they last saw their child. The parents need to know that if this was an offender who planned the abduction, then there is probably nothing they could have done. I once asked an abductor who had killed girls how we could stop him. He said, I suppose you would have to chain a child to the mother, but he added, no, that would not work. I would take both. The Times wrote, if Madeleine McCann was abducted by a paedophile, there is a chance that she is still alive and can be saved by sensitive policing, according to Ray Wire, a sexual crimes consultant. Lately there have been more and more cases where there has been an element of planning and an attempt to keep the child alive. The police must avoid doing anything to make the kidnapper panic. If he believes that they are about to move in and catch him, he may become so alarmed that he kills the child to stop her being a witness. He continued, Portugal is known to attract British paedophiles. A ring of 20 Britons set up there around 1990, filming sex acts with local boys and sending the tapes to Belgium and the Netherlands. Some were later jailed in England. The case helped to persuade the British government to make it illegal for Britons to have sex with underage children abroad. I went to Lisbon and became involved in the aftermath of that investigation. There were still lots of connections and other things going on. There have always been British paedophiles operating in Portugal. It seems then that Wire had fairly recent knowledge of a ring of British expat paedophiles in Portugal. Months later, the McCanns had a day with the Wires at their home. This is how the People reported the story. Kate and Jerry played no part in the disappearance of their daughter Madeleine, one of the world's top crime experts declared last night. Ray Wire, who has given cracker-style testimony to courts since the 1970s, said, it is absolutely impossible for them to have been involved. He insisted the grief-stricken parents were incapable of doing anything to harm their children. Wire, who's helped nail a string of monsters, including child killer Robert Black, said, I was with them for several hours, and I could not help but apply some of the practices I use when I'm carrying out assessments of suspects for police and the courts. I can state categorically there is no way they were involved in their daughter's murder or disappearance. They would be incapable of such an act. I have more than 30 years' experience in this field and am used to people trying to hide dark secrets. There was no sign of any such deceit. It is absolutely impossible for them to have been involved. He said for 3 days all they could see in their minds was Madeleine lying dead. They were in complete agreement she'd been taken by a predator, abused and killed. They were certain they would never see her alive again. The image of her lying murdered hardly left them, and they expected at any time to receive the news that her body had been found. The article was a great boost for the McCanns. Wire died just 5 months after those 7 hours with the McCanns. Obituaries praised him. The Guardian summed him up as a trailblazing therapist with a unique approach to sex offenders, one of the world's leading experts on sexual crime. The Times was just as exuberant. He was renowned for his pioneering work with people who sexually abused children. But there was a much darker side to Ray Wire, which makes one ask what his real connection was to the McCanns and why he praised them so much. After he started his Gracewell Clinic for sex offenders in 1988, it continually attracted controversy. He was known to have an obsession with witchcraft and the occult. He was much criticised for claiming that there was a major satanic child abuse ring in Nottingham. No evidence of it was found. 3 years later, he repeated the same disastrous mistake in Scotland, where one commentator said, perhaps the most disturbing of all is the evidence that the investigation team was influenced by Ray Wire, a former probation officer who describes himself as an independent sexual abuse consultant. Though the local authority refused to admit it, the investigators attended a special 3-day training programme in October 1991, organised by Mr. Wire's Gracewell Institute. Only after this did the allegations of satanic ritual abuse begin to flow. Almost unbelievably, despite this second setback, Wire tried the same thing again in Wales 3 years later. Another bout of satanic abuse hysteria broke out after Wire was paid thousands of pounds to run a 3-day conference on the subject. 3 years later, Wire was at the centre of another controversy. Channel 4's The Devil Amongst Us allowed 5 paedophiles to speak about their perverted desires, with one, Paul, quoted as saying, I would love to come out and have an open relationship with a child where we did the same things as heterosexuals do with each other. Society needs to stop discriminating against paedophiles. One of Wyer's major techniques for controlling the desires of sex offenders was what he called masturbation satiation. Offenders were required to watch pornographic films of an extreme nature as part of the therapy, while masturbating for a minimum of an hour and a half to 2 hours. Wyer claimed that if they masturbated frequently over a long period of time, they would reach saturation level and no longer be tempted to engage in criminal sexual acts. It is a claim that has never been verified except by Wyer himself, who said that none of those who underwent this treatment ever reoffended. Wyer told probation officers that such treatment should be mandatory. Wyer was into witchcraft and the occult, and after his death, his name appeared on the Elm Guest House list. Elm House in Barnes, West London, was used for years by politicians and celebrities for sex with boys, who were taken for that purpose from children's homes far and wide. The allegations have been investigated under Operation Fernbridge and are ongoing. The guest list, shown here, is document number 63 in a list of documents examined by the Metropolitan Police in what many people perceive as yet another series of establishment cover-ups of high-level paedophile rings. These scribbled notes were written down by Chris Foy while interviewing Carol Kasser, the ex-wife of the former owner of Elm House, in 1992. The seventh name on the list is Dr. Ray Wyer, Gracewell Clinic. These are mostly the names of actual patrons of the guest house who were abusing young boys. For other names on the list, Wikipedia tells us prominent people who attended parties at Elm Guest House are alleged to have included Liberal MP Sir Cyril Smith, the Conservative MP Sir Nicholas Fairbairn, the Soviet spy Anthony Blunt, the former British diplomat Sir Peter Hayman, and the Foreign Office barrister Colin Peters, who was later jailed in 1989 for being part of a network which abused over 100 boys. According to The Independent, other alleged visitors to the guest house include a Sinn Féin politician, a Labour MP, and several Conservative politicians. The Independent on Sunday reported that at least 3 men named in documents as visitors to the Elm Guest House were later convicted of multiple sexual offences against children. To summarise then, Ray Wyer was a creepy, witchcraft and sex-obsessed individual who was also a probable child abuser. Why did the McCanns want to spend a day with him and his wife? During the weeks that followed Madeleine's disappearance, one person local to Pride of Luz also offered the McCanns hospitality. That was Sir Clement Freud, grandson of Sigmund Freud and brother of Lucian Freud. He was also the father of Matthew Freud, whom I mentioned in my first Madeleine film and who married Rupert Murdoch's daughter Elizabeth. In her book, Kate McCann says that at the beginning of July, she got this letter from Freud. Dear McCanns, I have a house in Pride of Luz. Been ashamed of the intrusion to your lives by the media, and if you would care to come to lunch/dinner at any time before Wednesday next, do ring and let me know. I cook decent meals. Sincerely, Clement Freud. According to Kate McCann, they accepted the invitation, taking with them the twins, Kate's cousins Sandy and Tricia Cameron, and their PR agent Justine McGuinness, who was acting more or less as an assistant to their PR spokesman Clarence Mitchell. They went at midday, and Freud's first words to Kate were, "Can I interest you in a strawberry vodka?" She gratefully accepted, and then sat down to what she called a bloody marvellous lunch. The McCanns kept in touch with Sir Clement. On the 3rd of September, the McCanns learned that they might be made formal suspects. At 10 p.m. that day, the McCanns went round to see him for comfort and support, where Kate this time was offered, quote, a giant glass of brandy. And as we all now know, on the 14th of June 2015, we saw these banner headlines. Sir Clement Freud exposed as a paedophile. Sir Clement Freud accused of abusing 2 girls. These allegations surfaced in ITV's documentary the next day, Exposure, Abused and Betrayed, a Life Sentence. The internet had for years carried gossip that he had abused more than just 2 children. By all accounts, his attack on these girls had been violent. His wife, Lady Freud, who must have known about her husband's conduct, publicly apologised for his behaviour. A few days later, the press announced that there was a long history of emails between the McCanns and Freud after the McCanns returned to England. More details then emerged about Freud, including the revelation that when he was elected to Parliament as MP for Ely in 1973, he for many years shared his parliamentary office with the notorious Rochdale paedophile and fellow Liberal MP Sir Cyril Smith. So what is the significance of this? We have now met one certain paedophile, Clement Freud, and a witchcraft and sex-obsessed probable paedophile, Ray Wire. Both of these men have a connection with notorious paedophile Cyril Smith. Wire and Smith were apparently regulars at Elm House. In my first film, I exposed the huge influence of the security services in the Madeleine McCann case. I named MI5, Special Branch, other branches of the security services and government-funded security firms like Control Risks Group. There was a top-secret command group set up on the 8th of May 2007 under the chairmanship of Matt Baggett, the head of Leicestershire Police. These agencies were in direct contact with the McCanns. I ask, given Ray Wire's and Clement Freud's connection with Cyril Smith and possibly other paedophiles, how likely was it that government security services were fully aware of and monitoring all of them? I suggest it would be a certainty. In fact, these paedophiles must have been assets of the security services. The fact that the McCanns were not warned about these paedophiles adds weight to the assertion that they were assets of the security services and not merely being monitored by them. There has been an extremely close connection for 10 years now between the McCanns and the former head of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Unit, CEOP, Jim Gamble. He has spoken regularly on the McCanns' behalf. This was despite the obvious fact that the McCanns had publicly confessed in 2 national newspapers on the 5th of August 2007 to having left 3 young children, all under the age of 4, in a vulnerable situation on their own for significant periods of time, 6 nights in a row, and on their own evidence clearly failed to protect them. Of course, watchers of my films know different by now, but Gamble says he believes the McCanns and must also believe that they left their children alone for long enough to be abducted. Many questioned why an organisation with the words child protection in its title should feature the McCanns. Gamble, from Northern Ireland, got his first job in the Royal Ulster Constabulary, after which his rise was meteoric. An intelligence officer during the Kincora Boys' Home child abuse scandal, he rapidly became the head of the RUC's anti-intelligence unit. After that, he became head of Special Branch for the Belfast region. At the end of my first Madeleine film, I noted how the Kincora Boys' Home was used by MI5, who were supplying boys to prominent politicians, then filming the disgusting abuse on hidden cameras which they had installed. The films were then used to blackmail the politicians. What Gamble's role was at the time is not known. An article on Jim Gamble titled "Was Jim Gamble a corrupt police officer in Northern Ireland and did he authorise or cover up murders?" A look at the findings of Operation Ballast by Baroness Nuala O'Lone on the Northern Ireland Security Services deals specifically with the series of murders in the 1990s. It was devastating. Senior Special Branch officers murdered people, covered up murders, and were thoroughly corrupt. The corruption and abuse was widespread, of epidemic proportions. Gamble had a senior position at this time, but fortunately for him and the others, they were never actually named in the report. So perhaps we will never know how deep his role was in these murky matters. From Northern Ireland, he became Deputy Chief Constable of the National Crime Squad, which later morphed into the serious organised crime agency SOCA. There he was given special responsibility for dealing with the problem of child sexual abuse, and in 1999 was asked to head up the controversial Operation OR. This operation was inspired by information received from the United States. The authorities there had gained access to the database of Landslide, a place where people could access child sexual images by paying a fee by credit card. Wikipedia claims there were 3,744 arrests and 1,451 convictions, but also noted that the validity of the police procedures was later questioned as errors in the investigation resulted in large numbers of false arrests. There were at least 33 suicides resulting from Operation O.
We've had as many people kill themselves as we have identified those that abuse children. When you go through the door and show people that you're executing a warrant under the Protection of Children Act 1978, you have just blown the biggest hole in somebody's life that could possibly ever happen. Until now, they thought that they were safe in their environment, downloading child abuse images on a computer. They thought that it was acceptable for them to download indecent images on their computer. And you've suddenly gone in and told them, actually it's not, you're a paedophile. We ruin their lives.
Criticism of it centred around whether or not the owners of credit cards in Landslide's database actually accessed any sites containing child porn, unlike the US, where investigators had to determine in advance whether or not credit card subscribers had actually purchased child porn. Investigative journalist Duncan Campbell exposed these flaws in a series of articles in 2005 and 2007. There were many reports that the list of those investigated by Operation O included senior politicians, judges, celebrities and other VIPs, but none of these were prosecuted apart from Pete Townsend of The Who. And on the back of what was hailed as a success, the Blair government in 2006 appointed Jim Gamble the head of a brand new task force, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Service, or CEOP. Jim Gamble was right on Madeleine's case from day one. Within days, he interfered with the Portuguese police investigation by making a public appeal for people who had been in Praia de Luz around the time of the McCann's holiday to send him, and not the Portuguese police, their holiday photographs. He issued an email address which ensured that any images came direct to him. At this time, Leicestershire police were also involved in supposedly assisting the Portuguese police. So for what reason was CEOP, 2,000 miles away in London, involved in collecting these holiday photographs? Were they working with or against the Portuguese police? According to a source close to the investigation in the United Kingdom, several hundred photos were sent to the British authorities, most of them downloaded via internet pages specially created for the occasion. Jim Gamble stated, "We will then evaluate these images at a rate of 1,000 images an hour, so that before long we are sending the significant information to the Portuguese authorities." But did the Portuguese police ever get these images? No. Gonçalo Amaral wrote in his book, "None of these images ever reached us." Along with Gamble, two other characters keep popping up who seem to move in the same circles. One is a former police officer turned criminologist and self-professed child abuse expert Mark Williams Thomas. The other is Dr. Joe Sullivan, a psychologist. Soon after Madeleine was reported missing, the press reported, highly respected forensic psychologist Dr. Joe Sullivan arrived in Praia de Luz within days of Madeleine's disappearance as part of a so-called cracker team with Detective Chief Superintendent Graham Hill. He returned to the UK on the 9th of May 2007. He wasn't there for long then, but he had been specifically selected to go to Praia de Luz by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and was one of Gamble's trusted aides, having worked alongside him at CEOP. I also mentioned Mark Williams Thomas. He was also quick off the mark to get to Praia de Luz. He was already making several strong and detailed criticisms of the Portuguese investigation, even though he can have known little about what was really going on in the PJ offices in Portimao. Gamble, from 2007 onwards, heavily featured Madeleine on the CEOP website and in various CEOP publications, regularly using photos of Madeleine and the McCanns. Mark Williams Thomas continued to appear regularly on Sky News, pontificating about paedophiles and speculating about what might have happened to Madeleine. On the 15th of September 2007, the Gazeta Digital website published an article by Duarte Levy and Paulo Reis about Mark Williams Thomas and his views on the Madeleine McCann case, After hearing him on Sky News, they wrote, "Mark Williams Thomas urged Portuguese police to ditch the case against the McCanns, a case that he classified as ludicrous, and follow another lead that he thinks could take the PJ to the real kidnapper." And this is what he described as the similar disappearance of an 8-year-old girl, Joanna Cipriano, 2 years earlier. This comment, which went unchallenged, was almost unbelievable. The truth of the matter is that Joanna Cipriano's mother, Leonor Cipriano, and her brother brutally murdered the little girl after she discovered them committing incest. Both later made full confessions, the one by her brother being detailed, graphic, and gruesome in the extreme. The person who led the successful investigation was Gonçalo Amaral. Both murderers were sentenced to 16 years and are still in jail today. It beggars belief that Williams Thomas could get away with such a monumental untruth in front of millions of viewers. A professed expert, he had successfully fed the abduction myth. But then it was the Murdoch-owned and controversial Sky News that was giving Williams Thomas the airtime. On the 14th of September 2007, Mark Williams Thomas was questioned by Paulo Reis about his business relationship with the McCanns. He then admitted that his company, WT Associates, had a contract to provide services to the McCanns. But when asked to confirm in writing some details of that business relationship, he changed his initial answer, denying any relationship and admitting only that he has been in contact with the press officers for the family. It looks to me then that Williams Thomas was probably not an independent commentator on this case. On the 5th of November 2009, CEOP, under Jim Gamble's direction, produced a 1-minute video called "A Minute for Madeleine." It was a CEOP production featuring an age-progressed sketch of Madeleine as she might be aged about 6. And it was narrated by Gamble's friend, Dr. Joe Sullivan, also from Northern Ireland. According to the McCannfiles.com website, Sullivan helped in the production of and personally narrated the video and appealed directly to the person keeping a secret about Madeleine, who knows who's involved in her disappearance and who may have been groomed by the perpetrators to stay quiet. At the time, ITN News reported that the criminal psychologist behind a new Madeleine McCann appeal, Dr. Joe Sullivan, has told ITV News that her abductor is very likely to strike again. In October 2009, the McCanns had a private interview with Jim Gamble. Following that private interview, several press reports indicated that the then Labour Home Secretary Alan Johnson had asked Jim Gamble to recommend a new British police force to carry out a review and possibly a full investigation into Madeleine's disappearance. It was baffling why the Home Secretary, knowing Jim Gamble's extreme closeness to the McCanns, should choose him to recommend who should carry out an independent review into Madeleine's alleged disappearance. These discussions continued when Theresa May became Home Secretary in 2010 and led to the setting up of the Met Police's Operation Grange investigation. But as I said earlier, this has never been a real investigation. It was a psyop from day one. It almost seemed as if Gamble was running the McCann case. Gamble was recommending what form any review of the Madeleine McCann case would take. There is little doubt that Gamble shaped the Operation Grange review, which, as I've shown in my films, ended up only considering an abduction theory about Madeleine, and has ended up being a £13 million total failure. In May 2010, a general election saw a change of personnel, and Theresa May was made Home Secretary. She soon proposed that CEOP be brought back under the Serious Organised Crime Agency, now the National Crime Agency. Seeing it as a threat to his power, Gamble told May that he would resign his post as CEOP Chief Executive if she went ahead with her plans. This prompted the McCanns, supported by some of the media, to loudly praise and thank Gamble for his excellent work and condemn the Home Secretary for effectively scrapping CEOP as a separate organisation. A huge loss to child protection, they cried. Once again, this suggested a very close tie between the McCanns and Jim Gamble. Also, why were the McCanns so thankful to Gamble? After all, he hadn't found Madeleine. I believe they were thanking him for protecting them from prosecution. But Theresa May did go ahead with her plans and swiftly accepted Gamble's resignation. Since then, he has formed a very profitable business, Inique, which sells expensive courses on child protection to social services and child protection staff. But despite his new career, Gamble continues to tweet about the Madeleine McCann case on Twitter, aggressively challenging anyone on Twitter who questions the abduction myth. One other fascinating claim was made in 2015 relating to Gamble. Two US Madeleine researchers using the Internet Archive website Wayback Machine to investigate the history of the CEOP website said they had found a record of CEOP setting up a dummy page for Madeleine McCann on their website dated the 30th of April 2007. This is the day after I Suspect Madeleine died and 3 days before she was reported missing. If this could be proved, it confirms my theory that Madeleine died on the Sunday, triggering a frantic effort assisted by government agencies to plan a hoax abduction 4 days later. But the owners of the website removed the entry, claiming the entry was invalid. In my opinion, this issue is still not settled. It is fundamentally a technical argument, and I myself, with much experience of internet programming, am not convinced by any of the explanations people have put forward as to why the entry was invalid. Let's just mention a few other paedophile connections to this case. I dealt with Robert Murat earlier and the allegations by two witnesses that he had attacked a young girl and had child sexual abuse images on his computer. He was unable to explain to the police why he had encrypted material on his computer. One of the Prydeler's residents with whom Murat had business interests and whom he met up with between his early morning flight to Portugal and Madeleine's reported disappearance was a Russian expat, Sergei Malinka. Clearly, they were good friends and business associates. There were also allegations that he too had child abuse images on his computer, but it appears that he wiped his hard drive before the police could get to it. I will also mention Jane Tanner's interview by Leicestershire Police in April 2008. During a series of interviews, she made constant sexual innuendos, for example about the males in her group needing relief. She seems to have no idea that to constantly joke about sexual issues and use sexual innuendos in a police interview on a possible child abduction case was abnormal. These were not references to child sexual abuse, but they do suggest that the culture of the McCanns and their friends may have been fairly uninhibited on sexual issues. There is one other very important reason why this constant connection of the McCanns with the subject of paedophilia matters a great deal. And that's because of credible claims that both Jerry McCann and his good friend David Payne had a sexual interest in children. The allegation was especially credible because it was made by two general practitioners who had actually previously holidayed with the McCanns, Dr. Arul or Savio Gasper and his wife, Dr. Katharina Gasper. They were prompted, they said, by seeing the face of Dr. David Payne on television a few days after Madeleine was reported missing. Because of what they remembered happened on their previous holiday with the McCanns and the Paynes, they instantly thought that Dr. Payne might be connected to Madeleine's disappearance. They immediately contacted Leicestershire Police, who took formal statements from them. Dr. Katharina Gasper on the 16th of May said, "I was sitting between Jerry McCann and David Payne, and I think both were talking about Madeleine. I can't remember the conversation in its entirety, but they seemed to be discussing a particular scenario. I remember Dave saying to Jerry something about she, meaning Madeleine, would do this. While he mentioned the word this, Dave was doing the action of sucking one of his fingers, pushing it in and out of his mouth, while with his other hand he was doing a circle around his nipple with a circular movement around his clothes. This was done in a provocative way. There seemed to be an explicit insinuation about what he was saying and doing. I remember being shocked by that. I always felt it was something very weird and that it was not something anyone should say or do. I looked at Jerry and also at Dave to gauge their reactions. I looked around as if saying, "Did someone else hear that, or was it just me?" The conversation stopped for a moment, then we all began conversing again. Moreover, I remember Dave doing the same thing on another occasion. During our holiday in Mallorca, each parent would bathe all the children in turn. I was keen to stay near the bathroom if Dave was bathing the children. I remember I said to Savio to be careful and to be close by if Dave was helping to bathe the children, and my daughter in particular. Her husband, Dr. Errol Gasper, said in his statement, "During the period when we stayed at the villa, I remember a gesture made by David Payne. I do not remember the context of the conversation between David and Jerry, but I do remember seeing David use his left index finger to rub his nipple using circular movements, while he put his right index finger into his mouth, touching his tongue. I remember that when I saw this gesture, I immediately thought it to be in very bad taste, independently of the context of the conversation they were having. I don't know if anyone else saw the gesture apart from my wife, Katharina." Inexplicably, Leicestershire Police held on to these statements for an unbelievable 6 months before faxing them over to the Portuguese police. I suggest this was no mistake either, because they were sent over to Portugal a couple of weeks after Gonçalo Amaral had been removed from his post. I have to ask why any genuine police force would refuse to pass on information like this, which clearly the two Gasper doctors fully intended to be investigated. It seems that Leicestershire Police, or the associated powers that be they were colluding with, didn't want Gonçalo Amaral to know that instead of the possibility of the alleged abductor being a paedophile, he might be dealing with at least 2 paedophiles within the group of doctors that were claiming Madeleine had been abducted. Now, I want to come on to another video about Madeleine McCann. This was produced by Madeleine's godfather, Liverpudlian filmmaker John Corner, who plays a role in events after the 3rd of May 2007. In August 2007, he spent a week in the McCann's villa filming a video which he then leaked to a BBC Panorama team who made a documentary in 2007 making use of Corner's footage. On the 1st of May 2010, just ahead of the 3rd anniversary of Madeleine's disappearance, Corner released a 2.5-minute video which caused a storm of protest. What caused the protests were these 3 still images in the middle of the film. One press report explained, "Parents of Madeleine McCann who went missing 3 years ago have released a new video and photo of their missing daughter to mark the 3rd anniversary of the girl's disappearance." But the McCanns up till now had not in the previous 3 years ever displayed these 3 controversial photos. If it was explicitly approved by the McCanns, it was certainly a very strange decision. The first one has been called the floorboards photo. This one has been called the ice lolly photo. It was the middle one, however, which caused the greatest adverse reaction. It's been called the makeup photo, for obvious reasons, featuring much blue eyeshadow, a pink hair bow, lipstick and jewellery. She does not look happy. Many call it the Lolita photo. Like the other 2 photos, it was clearly posed. The photographer must have been positioned well below her head, looking upwards at her. When the video was released and an intense debate began about the choice of these 3 photos, the McCanns publicly claimed that the photo shows her when she was 3 after a raid on her mummy's dressing box. Could she have put the necklace on herself? Could she have applied the pink bow to her hair? Could she have applied the blue eyeshadow neatly? Or lipstick? Overwhelmingly, observers agree that the evidence from the photograph suggests that an adult made her up. And of course, an adult was on hand to take the photo. The McCanns have not said who took this photograph. Even if Madeleine had raided the dressing box as claimed, It is one thing to take a photo like that for your family photo album, but it's an entirely different matter to release it for millions to see. The next day, many media noted that Madeleine looked much older than her actual 3 years due to the makeup and jewellery. The Independent newspaper said, "Can the McCanns be thinking straight?" To keep their story alive, they have just released a moody video complete with a musical soundtrack which includes a photograph of the 3-year-old wearing makeup and gazing into the camera. It is that image which, predictably, has featured in the media. It seems a bizarre and unsettling development. Clearly, someone should surely have pointed out to them that in a case over which paedophilia casts an obvious shadow, it looks downright weird when a photograph which has the effect of sexualizing the missing child becomes part of the campaign to find her. Even Mark Williams Thomas, despite his unstinting support for the McCanns, was so shocked at the images that he went on his Twitter account stating that it was so inappropriate and so damaging. Another prominent commentator wrote, "I know what a picture of a child playing looks like. My parents have albums of pictures of my sister as a child playing with makeup, dressing up. I also understand when I'm seeing the deliberate sexualization of a child. I also know which end of the spectrum that those images lie." I've previously criticised people for expressing these sorts of views, but when you see the 3 Madeleine pictures in that video in close succession, you start asking, what's the probability that this is just some sort of accidental pose? I really don't like the answer. I'm not a photographer nor a filmmaker, nor actively involved in the media, and so if I can pick up on these references, then John Corner most certainly can. Newspapers were flooded with similar comments. Here's a selection. And there were hundreds more comments like this, all in the same vein. When I looked through the range of comments about the makeup photo, I found 2, both of which I think are very perceptive. I'm looking at her hair. The fringe is kind of grown out and comes to beneath her eyes, just like the last photo, the one of Maddie by the pool with Jerry and Amelie. If you look at pictures of her a few weeks before in Donegal, her fringe isn't that long. If it was taken before the holiday, it must have been just before, in my opinion. The second comment, also very observant. Still, I don't understand the purpose of the photo with the blue eyeshadow. Anybody notice that on this said photo, the right side of the background seems to show the same wall as the wall in the new released video? So was the photo taken while on holiday? Is the photo meant to remember somebody who was there when the photo was taken? I have compared the likenesses of Madeleine on the makeup photo with her on the last photo, and I think the similarities are striking. Here are my observations. Madeleine's face appears to indicate that the pictures were taken around the same time. The length of her hair and fringe appears to be identical. In both photos, she is seen wearing a pink hairbow or band. This is unusual as I can only find 2 other photos of Madeleine out of many where she has a hairband. They may not be the same bow or band, but clearly on both occasions an adult had been arranging her hair. On both photos, Madeleine can be seen wearing a pink top. Now, in addition to these observations, I note that in the makeup photo, Madeleine is photographed against a pale yellow, ochre-coloured stucco background, of a type rarely seen in England, but very common in Mediterranean countries like Portugal. Moreover, to the right of Madeleine's head is a dark-coloured object which could be a lamp holder, which again looks similar to the layout of properties in the Ocean Club. Here is an example. The blue object looks as though it might be a blue plastic chair, as shown here. Now, in my previous film, When Madeleine Died, you'll recall that I presented persuasive evidence that the so-called last photo must have been taken on the Sunday, the second day of the holiday, mainly because of the weather conditions. I also showed that there was no convincing evidence of any photos of Madeleine being taken after that date. I suggest that the makeup photo was taken in Praia de Luz that very week. There is no evidence that any photos of Madeleine exist after Sunday the 29th of April. So I suggest that the makeup photo was taken on the same day. Madeleine, to most observers, looks unhappy in this photo. Madeleine was also dressed up for the last photo. She has a pink smock on, and she had a pink hairbow or bead. In the makeup photo, she also has a pink top, maybe the same one. She still has a hair bead or bow, maybe different, but now additionally she has a necklace, eyeshadow and lipstick. It's a possibility then that the makeup photo was taken in the afternoon sometime after the last photo by the pool. And as I suggested in my last film, I think the time Madeleine died may have been within a few hours of that picture being taken. So is it possible then that the makeup photo is the true last photo of Madeleine? I have covered the subject of paedophilia, of child sexual abuse in some detail because, as I hope I have shown, it does appear to be relevant in some way to the reported disappearance of Madeleine McCann. By that, I do not mean to accuse the McCanns or any of their Tapper 7 friends of being paedophiles. The only evidence of this, indirect evidence, comes from the statements of Dr. Arrell and Dr. Katharina Gasper, which I will leave for you to interpret. Nor do I suggest that Madeleine was killed at the hands of a paedophile, though in this extraordinary case I don't think anyone can rule it out. The makeup photo, possibly taken on Sunday, is disturbing. But is it possible that however Madeleine died, by sedation, by accident or by a violent attack, that there is some kind of hidden connection that the McCanns or one of their friends have to some high-level paedophile ring? Let's not forget also that Peter Hyatt, an expert in statement analysis, concluded that there was a strong possibility of child sexual abuse in connection with this case. There is one more statement, and I hesitate to mention it because it is so graphic, but it is in Kate McCann's book. She describes how she imagined Madeleine having been abused. I told him about the awful pictures that scrolled through my head of her body, her perfect little genitals torn apart. Admitting to the existence of these images somehow confirmed them as a real possibility. Now, what was that doing in her book? On top of all these indications, there is one other obvious mystery that we must explain, and that is the astonishing way in which the government and the security services were all over the case from day one, and maybe even before if we count Robert Murat's dash to Praia da Luz 3 days before Madeleine was reported missing. What else could possibly account for this, except the cover-up of a potential national scandal over high-level VIP abuse of young children? It can only have been something very big and very bad. If the McCanns were in any way, however loosely, connected to a high-level paedophile ring, that would certainly explain it. I want to briefly examine some other theories that have been put forward to explain this remarkable top-level involvement. These centre around, firstly, the true genetic origin of Madeleine, and secondly, theories that the pharmaceutical industry was involved. Some people have suggested that most of the holidaymakers were swingers on an adult holiday, and that this was the reason for the cover-up. It is said that none of the high-profile attendees wanted to admit they were swingers. Others simply point to the McCanns' existing connections to the rich and powerful, such as Jerry McCann being on the committee of the nuclear energy quango Comore, along with Gordon Brown's brother Andrew Brown. One set of theories suggests Madeleine may not have been the child of both parents. These theories have included, firstly, that Madeleine was adopted, or secondly, that Madeleine was a surrogate child, or thirdly, that Madeleine was the result of a sperm donation by a third party. Other theories relating to genetic origin suggest that Madeleine was the product of some kind of genetic experiment, maybe with her DNA having been partly genetically engineered, or that she was a clone. In other words, a secret intelligence genetics or eugenics research program. The McCanns have always insisted that they are the natural parents of all 3 children. All were conceived by IVF treatment. Madeleine was born after IVF treatment in England and the twins after IVF treatment in Holland. One curiosity is that, so far as I'm aware, no photo of Kate being pregnant has ever been published. In her interviews in the early days, Kate said little about her pregnancy with Madeleine, describing it as easy and problem-free. In her book, she writes, "My pregnancy was totally without complications. No sickness, no back pain, no bleeding, no swelling. I felt great." And of Madeleine's birth, she said, "There she was, perfect." A specific allegation that Jerry McCann was not Madeleine's father first surfaced in the Portuguese press in the paper 24 Horas in September 2007. The story claimed that senior sources of the Portuguese police believed that they knew who the sperm donor was and stated that he had been traced and had been in England on the 3rd of May, the day Madeleine was reported missing. The newspaper claimed that this had been confirmed by Portugal's National Institute for Forensic Medicine. A source claiming to be from the Portuguese police said Jerry McCann was not the sperm donor for Maddie. He was the donor for the twins, but it's possible that Jerry himself doesn't know he's not the biological father. There may have been a switch at the laboratory. Another magazine, Tal Qual, repeated the allegation, causing Clarence Mitchell on Jerry McCann's behalf to issue a firm insistence that he was the true father of Madeleine and to threaten to sue the magazine. Finally, was there a connection to the pharmaceutical industry? Theories that the pharmaceutical industry was involved put forward that Madeleine, and maybe the twins as well, were being subject to a trial, authorised or unauthorised, of some new and potentially dangerous drug, and that a pharmaceutical company may have leaned on Mark Warner and the government to cover up their testing of a drug that was being trialled, which caused Madeleine's death. All this appears to be speculation, though I have discovered that two doctors on that holiday with whom the McCanns were friendly, Dr. Paul Weinberger and Julian Todman, have significant connections with the Government Chemical and Biological Warfare Centre at Portondown, Wiltshire. I had hoped to reach some kind of provisional conclusion about the most likely way Madeleine died, but I find that I simply cannot. I've discussed several ways she might have died, but at present I don't think there is sufficient available evidence to rule any of those theories out. But I firmly believe that she died, that the death was unexpected, and the McCanns and others had a strong reason to cover up her death. Look at this possible clue from Rachel Oldfield, one of the Tapper 7, published by the Daily Mirror on the 25th of April 2008, just before the 1-year anniversary. She was quoted as saying, "If you take the common sense approach and look at timings and the fact that they are medics and there are 4 other medics in the group, they would know what to do to resuscitate a child." Who said anything about resuscitating a child? Where did that come from? Was it a Freudian slip? Perhaps I shouldn't use that word anymore. It immediately raises the possibility that Madeleine had perhaps been rendered unconscious. But if that is what happened, it would line up with all of our scenarios. It would line up with an overdose of sedatives or drugs, an accident, or an attack by one of the parents, or maybe by a third party, so we are none the wiser. And another clue from Dr. David Payne when he was asked by the police about whether the McCanns had a kit bag for their tennis gear, replied by first saying they certainly didn't have a great big tennis bag, and then went on to say, but it certainly wasn't a big tennis, things that you could put a tennis racket in. There was nothing of that size that you could hide a tennis racket in or anything like that. Is this a clue that Madeleine's body was carried in a tennis bag? But again, if it is, it still sheds no light on how she may have died. To my mind, there is one theme in this case that tends to dominate all others, and that is the truly vast scale of involvement of the government and its security arms such as MI5 and Special Branch in protecting and supporting the McCanns. I gave many details in my first Madeleine film. 10 years on, this active government involvement continues. What might the government wish to cover up above all else? I suggest that they would be most worried if it emerged that senior politicians and members of the government, perhaps very high profile, were revealed to have been involved in very immoral and very illegal acts. High profile people who we think are autonomous might actually be being controlled directly because they have been trapped by security agencies carrying out child sexual abuse. If this was uncovered, it means these high-profile people can no longer hold office, and the security service loses control of their carefully manufactured assets. As we've seen in recent years, this is probably just the tip of an iceberg, with high-level politicians and celebrities being involved in paedophile rings. The McCanns brought paedophilia into their daughter's disappearance from day one. They went on to develop several news stories about paedophile gangs having stolen Madeleine to order. It may be that the McCanns' connection to the world of paedophiles is only slight, but even if they just had personal knowledge and proof of one very key person who was a paedophile, that might just be enough for a panic-stricken government to trigger the huge amount of support from British police and security services, government and media, who all seemed available at the drop of a hat to swing into action on the morning of Friday the 4th of May, and create such a powerful abduction scenario that 10 years on, most British people still believe it. I do not suggest that there is any evidence that Madeleine was killed as the result of an attack by a paedophile. But then, like so many others, I am troubled by the Lolita photograph of Madeleine. It's a very disturbing thought that an adult could make up Madeleine in a highly sexualized way in order to make her available for a paedophile. As for the cause of death, I have taken you where I can, but have not been able to completely rule out any of the suggested causes. And here's where I need your help. If you have any knowledge or view or opinion on what may have happened, please email me. This may be my last scheduled film about Madeleine McCann, but if anything new and credible should emerge, be sure I will be telling you about it. Thanks very much for watching this series of films. Just one final point on why I made these films. I made them to show to the widest audience what mainstream media are really about. If you've watched my whole series, which now amounts to about 14 hours of documentary, please follow these links and watch a BBC documentary about the case and a BBC interview with Robert Murat. With the knowledge you have gained from my films, you can now watch this BBC propaganda in its true context and know fully what they are up to.